Alaska, dubbed the last frontier. Expansive and remote in many places, it can be an ideal hiding ground for a killer. On a Sunday night in a small town where everyone knew each other, a young woman waved goodbye to her friends and vanished. She felt secure enough to walk home alone. But what happens when you're blissfully unaware that someone with dark intentions is watching you? Are we ever truly safe when we're completely alone? First, I have the privilege to introduce you to a sweet, fun-loving, and outspoken Indigenous Alaskan woman named Sonia Ivanoff. Sonia was born on April 13, 1984 to Larry and Maggie Ioff, two very hardworking members of the Anahl village. Anahl is on the far western edge of Alaska, on a small strip of land where the Norton Sound meets the Unalakleet River. It's a fishing village where they catch salmon and king crab, and it's beautiful. In the winter, it has scenic views of the Alaskan tundra. However, only about 700 people live there. 3/4 of the residents are Alaskan Native, specifically Yupik and Inupiaq. This case is set in 2003, and language does change over time, so I want to be as respectful as possible and use the tribal names unless I'm referring to Indigenous Alaskans as a whole. Sonia was an Inupiaq, and she was the fourth of 6 children. Growing up, they lived in a tiny 3-bedroom house, which meant all the siblings were very close. She shared a bedroom with her sister Christina, who was 7 years older than her. Since they had 4 brothers, they depended on one another to keep up the feminine energy. The 2 girls shared a room and would dress up in matching clothing and costumes. Christina loved to do her little sister's hair and makeup, which actually sparked Sonia's love for everything from lip gloss, lipstick, and makeup of all kinds, to always looking her best. As a middle child, Sonia did her best to stand out, and it wasn't that hard. By the time she went to Frank A. Degnan High School, she was 5 feet 11 inches with long, dark hair, beautiful hazel eyes, expressive eyebrows, and a huge smile. Sonia was always happy and having a good time. She stuck up for the underdog and always spoke her mind, even if that meant standing up to authority. If she was annoyed, you would know it. She spent her life trying to build people up instead of tearing them down. She was on the honor roll, and she was also a skilled member of the basketball team. Not only was she tall, but she was strong, athletic, and tough, and definitely a team player. Sports were actually very big in her village, and also in Nome, the area near where she grew up. They're known for cross-country running, skiing, dog sledding, and winning state titles for basketball year after year. Sonia's high school mascot was the Wolf Pack, and as a senior, she became one of the pack leaders, with all the freshmen and sophomores looking up to her. The basketball team would travel for varsity games, and Sonia shared a hotel room with her best friend, Tamer Tawarak. They'd been attached at the hip since they were just kids, and they had sleepovers, shared the same bed, wore each other's clothing and makeup, and even finished each other's sentences. Where one of them was, the other one was not far behind. On these trips, Sonia always came prepared with her camera. She loved taking pictures and videos of herself and her friends, just talking, laughing, snacking, doing each other's hair, hanging out by the pool, and just being teenagers. When Sonia was a teen, she also became an aunt. Christina got married to a man named Tom Mell, and they had 3 children, Sarah, Gabby, and Ethan. Sonia adored children, and she knew one day she wanted to have a family of her own. As an Inupiaq woman, Sonia was proud of her heritage. She loved learning traditional dances and family recipes. Where she lived, it was common to eat caribou, seal, salmon, and a type of Arctic bird known as ptarmigan. She also knew how to make a very unique dessert called akutak. It's an ice cream made with fish and berries. Once she turned 18, she participated in the Arctic Native Brotherhood pageant, wearing traditional Inupiaq clothing. She impressed the audience with her sense of humor and compassion. By the time Sonia graduated in 2002, she really wanted to get a place of her own and be more independent. She decided to get an apartment in Nome, Alaska, where she had done the pageants and tried out for the City League basketball team. She also landed a job as a receptionist at the Norton Sound Health Corporation, where her dad Larry had previously served as chairman. She was in charge of checking people in and out of the hospital, including emergency cases. Nome was 70 miles away from where she grew up, and it had a bigger population of about 3,500 people. It was also right against the Northern Sound. In the early 1900s, Nome had the biggest population of any city in Alaska because of the gold rush. But by 2003, many gold mines were actually shut down, and Nome was known for its tight-knit community, gloomy weather, and a big drinking and sports culture. Sonia was well respected for her work ethic and her basketball skills, and she really liked living in Nome. But she had much bigger plans. She was saving up for college and wanted to move to Hilo, Hawaii, because she didn't want to be in the cold any longer. In the summer of 2003, Sonia's best friend, Tamer, moved in with Sonia in their apartment. Tamer was also working the front desk at a hotel, the Aurora Inn, where she worked in the early mornings. They kind of had opposite schedules, but still, they made time for their friendship, hanging out. They even shared a bed together. Their group of friends would come over to watch movies, play board games, or even play basketball. Sonia and Tamer liked late-night snack runs to a gas station, the Soro station, where Sonia would buy boxes of green tea. She also loved salt and vinegar chips. Now, they didn't own a car, so they had to walk everywhere, but they weren't too worried about it because Nome was safe. However, Sonia's big sister, Christina, and her husband, Tom, warned Sonia to be careful. They were glad that Tamer was living with her now because they thought it was unsafe for an indigenous Alaskan woman to live alone. It's tragically common that indigenous women go missing, especially in Alaska, where the cases are even higher than anywhere else. In the state, the winters are brutally cold, and there's so much uncharted wilderness that if one evil person wants to, they have every opportunity to erase the evidence. Tom was so worried that he actually pulled Sonia aside and told her that he had no idea who she was hanging around with or where she spent her time off. If anything were to happen to her, he wouldn't even know where to start looking. Sonia assured him that she was safe, and the thing is, Sonia never really thought about the town being dangerous. Everyone knew one another, or so they thought. Tamer and Sonia were each other's safety nets. If they were staying at a friend's house overnight, they would call each other using their work phones to check in. They didn't have cell phones back then. The summer of 2003, 19-year-old Sonia and Tamer were enjoying the long days of warm weather. Well, as warm as it gets in Alaska. On Sunday, August 10th, they went over to a friend's house, I'm going to call her Willow, to play some board games and have a couple of drinks. At this time of year in Alaska, it stays bright outside until much later, sometimes as late as midnight. So if you're going out at 10 p.m. or even 11 p.m., it still feels early. That night, they stayed up until about 1 lies. Sonia had one beer, and she was wide awake. It was her weekend off, and she didn't have to be back at work until Tuesday afternoon. So she told Tamer she wanted to hop over to another friend's house before heading back to their apartment. She didn't say which friend, and Tamer was way too exhausted to go home at that point. Since she had to get up at 6 a.m. for work the next day, she decided to sleep at Willow's place. Sonia stood up to leave, wearing a pair of jeans and Tamer's Skechers shoes. Her apartment keys were attached by a chain to her wallet, which hung off her arm by a metal band. Outside, it was misting rain, which was actually Sonia's favorite weather. She decided to walk instead of taking a taxi. Sonia and Tamer said goodbye with their usual hand gesture and saying, which involved taking their index and middle fingers, tapping them twice against their shoulders, twice against their lips, then making a peace sign while saying, "Peace out, pal." They exchanged this gesture, and nothing seemed different from any other night. After this, Sonia walked northwest toward her friend's house. The next morning, when Tamer woke up on Willow's couch around 5 a.m., she took a taxi back to her apartment to get ready for work. When she arrived, she noticed that Sonia wasn't sleeping in their shared bed. Still, Tamer wasn't concerned at first. She figured Sonia may have stayed over at her friend's house, so she went off to work, assuming Sonia would check in later. But hours went by, and she still hadn't heard from Sonia all day. Even though that wasn't too unusual, it did raise a red flag for Tamer. She called 4 of their mutual friends asking if anyone had seen her, and also contacted Sonia's sister Christina to see if maybe Sonia had stayed over there, but no one had seen or heard from her. Christina then told her husband Tom that Sonia wasn't calling Tamer back. They thought maybe the girls had gotten into an argument and Sonia needed some time to cool off. But Tamer insisted that if either of them were mad, they'd always talk about it. When Tamer got home that evening and Sonia still wasn't at the apartment, she started to worry. What made it worse was the sight of Sonia's makeup bag. Now, you may or may not think this is odd, but her makeup bag hadn't been touched. This was very out of the ordinary, and it worried Tamer. It worried her more than Sonia not being home because Sonia always did her hair and makeup every single day, especially on her days off. Some people just have a routine, and this was Sonia's. She was always made up, with her hair and makeup done. The next day, on Tuesday morning, Tamer went to work again as usual, but she kept calling everyone she could think of, because Sonia still wasn't home. She called Sonia's sister Christina and of course her husband Tom, telling them that Sonia was missing and asking them to contact Sonia's parents, Larry and Maggie. She even called the Nome Police Department to ask if Sonia was in jail. This is actually a normal thing to do when you can't find someone. It's important to call hospitals, jails, and sadly, even coroner's offices to see if someone is injured, incarcerated, or even deceased and needs to be identified. But the dispatcher said Sonia wasn't there. So, when Tamer got off work at 5 p.m., she immediately headed to the police department to officially report her friend missing. At 5:15 p.m., she walked through those doors. It was a very tiny police department with only about 7 officers. When Tamer arrived, she hysterically started crying, talking about how her roommate was missing after going to a party on Sunday night. Officer Stan Piskoya asked a lot of questions, mostly about Sonia's drinking habits, thinking that maybe she was just off partying too hard, and he wasn't taking Tamer very seriously at all. He was brushing it off as teenage drama. But Tamer insisted Sonia only had 1 beer that night, and nobody had heard from her in 40 hours. But to be fair, Tamer didn't know what Sonia did after she left her presence. She left around 1 o'clock in the morning, and technically, the night was still a bit young at that point, so she could have done anything. Around this time, Sonia's boss at the hospital started calling around because she hadn't shown up for work. That was Ari, unlike her, so eventually, her boss made a call to the police station as well to report her missing. Suddenly, the officers took the case much more seriously. With Tamer's help, they filed an official missing persons report, and the Ivanoff family was informed that Sonia had disappeared. Christina and Tom asked around to see if anyone had heard from her. Tom drove to Nome, scoping out locations that Sonia might have visited. Which friend was she with that night, they wondered? Could it be her friend, Kunuk? Now, Kunuk was a nickname. His name is Daniel Angus, and he went by Kunuk. He was one of Sonia's closest guy friends. He was obviously interested in her more than just a friend, but he did have a girlfriend, and Christina thought the two of them would end up together. However, Sonia insisted that Kunuk was just a friend. That being said, they did have quite a flirtatious relationship and they had a lot in common. Christina and Tom liked him, and even though he seemed to have a big ego, deep down, he was like a teddy bear. They wondered if Kunuk knew where she went, so they called him, but he had no clue. So, Tom went down to the police station to inquire about whether they knew where Kunuk's camp was. By that time, it was Tuesday evening, around 5:30. Officer Byron Redburn was assigned to this case. First, he talked to Tamer. He asked her all about Sonia's mood, her mental health, and her relationships. Tamer said that Sonia was a happy person, so Redburn asked if they had argued. Tamer said they always talked through their disagreements and their feelings. She confided in Redburn that she could barely sleep in the apartment without Sonia there. Redburn said, "Well, she's somewhere, and I know this could come off as insensitive, but it was the truth. Sonia was out there. They just had to find her." Redburn investigated Sonia's apartment. Other than her wallet and her keys, all of Sonia's belongings were at the house, including her makeup, her shoes, and her coats. They could tell she never came home. The items of clothing that she was last seen wearing were nowhere in the apartment. He looked for clues that would indicate some kind of motive or kidnapping, maybe like a threatening letter or maybe a concerning journal entry, but they didn't find anything. Tamer told Redburn that a couple of girls from their high school were pretty jealous of Sonia because of her talent and her beauty, but she couldn't imagine any of them doing any harm to Sonia. Then Redburn went through all of her photo albums, since she did have a hobby of taking a lot of pictures, and there were plenty. Redburn found one photo of Sonia standing by a river. She was grinning and wearing a tank top with her arms outstretched. There was a large purple bruise on her right bicep. So, of course, Redburn asked Tamer about this bruise, and she let him know that it was caused by their friend at a recent movie night. They had all been wrestling and punching each other on the arms, and Kunuk took it a little too far. We've definitely heard his name once before already, so Redburn dug a little deeper and asked about Kunuk. Tamer admitted she kind of had mixed feelings about him. They were friends, but he was known to have a short temper. He'd expressed interest in Sonia at one point, but he had an on and off girlfriend, and Sonia had told Tamer he wasn't her type. So Redburn figured that if Sonia would have maybe rejected him, he could have caused her harm. Maybe he got angry that night, maybe they were drinking, maybe that was a motive to kidnap her, or even something worse, especially if alcohol had been involved. In the meantime, investigators mobilized the search for Sonia. Chief Ralph Tiller, who had worked for the department for over 5 years, asked the fire department to help them. They deployed search and rescue boats in the river and sea in case Sonia had fallen in or gone swimming and drowned. It had been raining from midnight on Monday, August 11th to 5 p.m. that same day. So officers went north to search the tundra and even abandoned mines, hoping to find fresh tracks in the mud. They prayed that they would find Sonia alive. The Nome Police Department told Sonia's sister Christina and her husband Tom that they had it covered as far as manpower, but the family felt compelled to search. Tamer and her friend Maya drove around in Maya's car for the rest of that evening. But then, around 9 p.m., when they stopped by the hospital where Sonia worked to see if she had shown up, one of her co-workers told Tamer that she should probably go back to the police station. She and Maya hurried over there. At the Nome Police Department, they found a large gathering of people, and Tamer was like, okay, wow, they must have found her. So she jumped out of the car and searched the crowd for Sonia, but her heart sank. She wasn't there. But she wasn't wrong. They had found her best friend, but not the way anyone would have hoped. Soon, Tamer learned that a body of a female had been found out in the tundra. Tamer dropped to her knees. She was in complete denial. It didn't feel possible. How could it be Sonia? It couldn't be Sonia, but it was. At 8:30 p.m., after a 3-hour search, volunteer firefighter John Larson was searching 5 minutes north of Nome when he and his wife found fresh tire tracks on Dredge 5 Road off of the Nome-Teller Highway. It's right here on the map. This road actually led to an abandoned gold mine. It was overgrown from lack of use and very private, full of tall grass and willow bushes. The road had turned to mud, and the rain caused the tire tracks from one vehicle to leave fresh prints 5 feet from the road. Obscured in the bushes, John found the body of a young woman. He immediately headed back to the station and picked up Officer Brian Wayana, another important name you want to know in this case. Detective Wayana was the first person to arrive at the crime scene. He came prepared. He had cameras, evidence bags, and plastic tarps. Wayana took the long way through the brush, avoiding the road so he didn't interfere with any of the evidence. John led him to where he found the woman's body. They assumed it was Sonia, but they couldn't be sure. She was lying on her side, and her face was obscured. She wasn't wearing any clothes, except for one sock on her left foot. Redburn got the news that a body had been found, and he paused his investigation of Sonia's relationships to visit Dredge 5 Road. When he got there, he noticed leaves on Sonia's back, indicating she had been there for a while, at least 24 hours. Redburn confirmed it was Sonia, and she was deceased. There were no obvious injuries to her, other than the bruise on the side of her face. But Redburn felt that it was clear this was sexually motivated because of her missing clothing. Now, Wayofana and Redburn knew the Severners police force would not have enough manpower for a homicide investigation, so they called the state troopers. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation team could not fly there until the morning, so Redburn and Wayofana picked up any evidence they thought could be destroyed by the wind or by animals. They used a giant plastic tarp to cover the road and Sonia's resting place, including her body, and they pinned it down with stones. They had to go to extreme measures to make sure that no grizzly bears or any other animals interfered with the crime scene. Here's a photo of that area covered with the tarp. Chief Taylor and Officer Owens also showed up to assess the scene and stand guard overnight. The officers took shifts guarding that area, and I'm actually very impressed with all their efforts and their care in preserving the evidence. It's clear that they took this very seriously, especially Wayofana. Mayor already knew what was happening, but Christina, Tom, Larry, Maggie, and all 4 of Sonia's brothers were still in the dark. The chief of police headed out to Yal to let them know in person. Tom and Christina met with law enforcement on their porch, and their suspicions were confirmed. Nome wasn't a safe place for a woman, and Sonia's life had been taken way too soon. Tom had the impossible job of calling her parents, Larry and Maggie, to let them know that Sonia had been murdered and the family grieved. The next morning, investigator Eric Burrows of the state troopers and criminalist Carrie Cathcart flew in from Anchorage, a city 500 miles away. Cathcart was in charge of forensic processing. She would take photographs, sketch the scene, and mark each piece of evidence with a number. She would also test blood and figure out what happened. You can see her in these photos, wearing an orange and red rain jacket. As soon as Cathcart got to the scene, she noticed that Sonia had been stripped of her clothing except for a sock. There was evident bruising and blood on the left side of her chest and face, but no apparent cause of death. Cathcart did tape lifts of her body, hoping to find fingerprints, hair, or DNA evidence that would lead to a perpetrator. When Cathcart lifted Sonia's head, that's when she realized that Sonia had been shot, and the gunshot wound was to the back of her head, obscured by her hair. It would have caused significant bleeding, but there was no blood in the immediate area. Investigators searched for shell casings, but they couldn't find any, nor could they find her clothing or a murder weapon. Sonia's killer had cleaned up the evidence and had taken everything except one sock. About 5 feet away from Sonia, Cathcart noticed a dark spot on the dirt that had been run over by a vehicle. So she tested it with a hemostick, and it was blood. It wasn't a pool of blood because the blood had mixed in with the mud and had also been run over when the mud was still wet. But when it dried in the sun, it created a thick tire tread that Cathcart was able to take imprints of, using a rubbery liquid substance that dentists actually use to cast teeth. As many of you might know, I'm still in school for death investigation. It's been going on for about 2 years now, and this process absolutely fascinates me. I really like to understand every detail of these investigations. Cathcart figured that this was where Sonia was shot. She had lost blood while lying there for some time, and then the perpetrator moved her body into the bushes to conceal it from the road. There were no significant scratches on Sonia's skin. The perpetrator probably took her clothes off after she was killed, which made it less likely that this was actually a sexual violation in her mind, even though they would have to wait for Sonia's autopsy to figure that out. The tire treads were a huge piece of evidence, not only because they were fresh, but there was something else. There were 2 different types of tread. 3 tire treads were exactly the same, but one was different. These tracks would have been made with a car that had one mismatched tire. The tracks showed that the vehicle turned onto Dredge 5 Road, did a U-turn at the dead end, and returned to the highway. The perpetrator likely drove Sonia to this location, killed her, and left without realizing investigators could track down a vehicle with just the tire treads. Then, on one of the willow bushes that was hanging out onto the road, Cathcart noticed something. A patch of paint transfer on a branch. It was what they call robin's egg blue, kind of like a lightish blue color, and high enough that it probably came from a truck or an SUV. So Cathcart took samples of this paint and sent it to the lab, where they confirmed this was standard vehicle paint. They were looking for a blue truck with one different tire. Now, in a town of 3,500 people, it shouldn't be too hard, right? But back to Officer Redburn's investigation into Sonia's relationships. He had asked Tamer to make a list of all of Sonia's friends. The person they were most interested in talking to was Kunuk, so they brought him in for an interview. He said that he and Sonia were friends, but he would never hurt her. When questioned about his alibi, he said that on the night of August 10th, he was hunting with a group of his friends 73 miles away. Redburn and Eric Burrows got the names of all of his friends, and they interviewed them as well. They confirmed that they all went hunting Sunday night and got back on Monday afternoon. They camped in cabins that were basically shacks. However, Kunuk was staying in a separate cabin from everyone else. So it's plausible that he could have driven an hour and a half back to Nome, killed Sonia, and then driven back to the campsite without anyone knowing because they were asleep. They figured if Kunuk was smart enough to strip the entire crime scene of evidence, then he might be smart enough to manufacture this alibi. Burrows and Redburn had the probable cause to apply for a search warrant for Kunuk's house and his vehicle. Burrows looked into his criminal history and found reports of a domestic incident. He had gotten physical with his girlfriend. They had a child together, and he had gotten into several fights that escalated. Redburn told Burrows about Kunuk's notoriety for a short temper that his friends mentioned, and they felt like this guy was dangerous. It took days for the warrants to go through, so for the rest of August 13th and 14th, police canvassed the entire neighborhood to figure out what path Sonia could have taken to her friend's house. They heard from a few witnesses. One was Rena Golden, who said that a little after 1 o'clock in the morning, she saw Sonia walking in the rain. Another witness, Lamb, was a janitor who worked the late-night shift at the gas station, Tesoros. They said they saw Sonia walking between 1 o'clock and 1:15 in the morning. This is the same gas station where Sonia usually bought snacks on Front Street, and she was heading northwest. Nobody knew which friend she had visited, but her apartment with Tamer was on the northwest side of town as well, close to the airport off of 3rd Avenue. So maybe that's where she was walking before something happened or someone intervened. The search warrant finally went through for Kunuk's house and car, and let me tell you, what they found was very significant. In his bedroom was a pair of red and white striped Adidas sneakers, but they had a bright red stain, a fresh one, in the left inner heel that was most certainly blood, or so it seemed. Then in the garage, guess what they found? A blue Dodge pickup truck. And I'm not talking about any old truck. It wasn't just the exact color of the paint left behind on the branch. It had 3 tires of one brand and a 4th tire with a different brand. The mismatch was a Goodyear tire, and it was in the exact same spot where the mismatched tire was at the crime scene. Carrie Cathcart was called in to process Kunuk's pickup truck, and they found blood everywhere. On the floorboards of the truck, there were droplets of blood on the fabric upholstery, and in the truck bed, they found a huge blue tarp covered in dried blood. There were 3 hunting rifles kept immediately behind the driver's seat, and there was blood on the butt of one of the guns. If this is not a smoking gun, I don't know what is. But Cathcart knew if this was the vehicle they were looking for, then Kunuk had driven over the blood with the mismatched tire. So she tested all 4 tires with a chemical called luminol. It interacts with blood and glows green. It's kind of like luminol, but glows a different color. And sure enough, on the mismatched tire, they found blood, and it was splattered onto the fender. This definitely sealed the deal. This had to be the truck that drove straight through the crime scene, and these items had to be used in the commission of Sonia's murder. Since they belonged to Kunuk, he had to be their guy. He had a motive, a very shaky alibi, and even blood evidence on things he owned. But they didn't want to arrest him until they were sure the DNA matched up, or they could find the clothing, a murder weapon, or a witness that tied him to the crime scene. Always remember that they want to build an airtight case and not make any arrests prematurely. It could tip off the perpetrator to dispose of even more evidence. Meanwhile, the truck was towed to Nome Police Department for further processing. Redburn interrogated Kunuk again, and this time he took a tape recording. When Redburn asked him the last time he saw Sonia, he said that he hadn't talked to her in almost 2 weeks. The last time he had physically seen her was Friday when she was on her lunch break, and he said he didn't even say hi to her. That was the last time he ever saw her. He insisted he left Nome at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday and didn't return until late Monday night, long after Tamer couldn't get a hold of Sonia. Redburn asked him to remove his shirt because he thought if he had shot Sonia in the tundra, he might have had scratches from the willow bushes, or maybe scratches from Sonia herself. There was one horizontal scratch on his back, and he said that scratch had nothing to do with Sonia. He admitted it was actually from his girlfriend. They got into a physical fight, and she had scratched him with her nails. Well, that does not sound very good, so they took him back to Norton Sound Hospital for a full examination, but the scratch was the only injury Kunuk had. Remember, Redburn did ask him to give a DNA sample, and he complied. Redburn said if they found any evidence during Sonia's autopsy, they wanted to be able to compare the results. If Kunuk was innocent, then he'd be exonerated. In that interview, Kunuk asked why they suspected him at all, and that's when Redburn said, "There's been some things coming up that make you and your vehicle interesting." It turns out there are a bunch of tire impressions out there that are similar to the tires that you have on your car. So, Kunuk is sitting there asking, "That's the only thing that's tying me? Mismatched tires? That's pretty usual." But then they explained that they had blue paint transfer at the scene as well. Then Redburn asked if there was any reason Kunuk would have blood on his car and his shoes, and at first he said no, there was no reason for blood. But then, when he was pressed further, he changed his story. He said that he'd hit a rabbit when he was driving, so he pulled over, and the rabbit was still alive, and he had to put the rabbit out of its misery, so he stomped on it with his shoe. As for the blood on the tarp and the gun, Kunuk said that he had shot some animals on his hunting trip, including a porcupine. I'm thinking, do porcupines bleed that much? I don't know because I am not a fan of killing animals, but he didn't specify whether he was hunting for sport or food, or whether the tarp was used to drain blood from many animals. Redburn wasn't convinced. He was looking at the facts, and everything matched up. They just had to wait for the DNA results. So all that week, Redburn, Burroughs, and Chief Taylor followed up on a dozen tips. One woman, a 32-year-old named Florence, called the tip line and told Taylor she had actually seen Sonia the night that other people had as well. She gave a description of Sonia's clothing, jeans and boots, and she said she had seen Sonia get in the passenger seat of a police car. Now, Taylor wrote down Florence's name and number and promised to call her back, but when he did, he must have written down the number wrong because it was a different Florence, and she had no idea what he was talking about. Florence Habros had only called in the tip line because her co-worker at the Bering Sea Woman Group had convinced her to do it. When Chief Taylor didn't call her back, she was actually pretty concerned for her own safety as a Yupik woman. Florence didn't trust the man-dominated police department, and now she knew that she went out of her way to almost accuse the Nome Police Department of being the last to see Sonia if it truly was her that got into a police car. That wasn't the only sketchy behavior. The week after Sonia's death, Tom visited the Nome Police with a print picture of Sonia to remind them of the urgency of her case. When he tried to hang it up on the wall, one of the officers, Matt Owens, yelled at him for ruining their new drywall and then told him to leave. Tom was a little concerned about the treatment he was getting. I mean, that is pretty harsh, and so Tom showed up at 8 o'clock every day looking for updates, but there were none. It was an open investigation, so officers couldn't reveal any important information about anything, not even suspecting Kunuk. But Tom's frustrations were valid. It was taking a long time to even issue a warrant. And I know that it's very hard for families. I've seen so many express their frustration with not getting enough updates, but I also understand it can compromise the investigation. I've heard it stated this way: Once you die, you're property of the state you died in. So in cases of homicides, it's the state's duty now to take possession and work the case. Sadly, parents and loved ones kind of take a back seat until the state is finished, and then they can be released, and that is very tough. On August 25th, about 2 weeks after Sonia was killed, her autopsy was carried out by Chief Medical Examiner Frank Filico. Her manner of death was officially ruled a homicide, and her cause of death was a close-range, execution-style shot aimed at the back of her head. Filico used an X-ray to find a .22 caliber bullet, which is a common semi-automatic bullet, but this bullet had a special pattern of grooves that matched it to a rare type of gun. There was also bruising to her face, neck, and chest, with some blood indicating Sonia was hit as she fought back against her attacker. This wasn't a surprise attack. She was a strong and fierce woman. But what had shocked Dr. Filico was the lack of DNA evidence found on her body. She had not been sexually violated. The swabs of most of her private areas were negative for semen. There was no skin underneath her fingernails, no foreign hairs, no fibers, or fingerprints, and her clothes still had not been found. All of this pointed to a killer who had what's referred to as evidence awareness. And this means that they knew to take evidence with them, or destroy it, or clean the scene somehow. Either that, or they were just lucky. Sonia was laid to rest by her family and friends in Anala Cleat. At first, her family didn't think they were even going to be able to have an open casket because of the damage and bruising to Sonia's face. But her older sister, Christina, knew how much Sonia loved to look pretty and do her makeup, so she did something so brave. Christina took it upon herself to do her sister's makeup for the very last time in her casket. Christina carefully and successfully covered the bruises with makeup, and then she did Sonia's eye makeup, lipstick, and everything else for the very last time. It was a routine that they had done together as children, and knowing this was the last time she would ever do that was brutal. The ceremony was held in the same gym where Sonia had won her most important basketball games. People from surrounding villages came to tell their stories and to honor her life. She was buried in Yanala Siali Cemetery, and Tamer actually decided to move back to Enali to be closer to her support system. I'm sure she was probably so devastated and did not also want to live by herself after this. Now back to the investigation. Officers tested their theory about Kunuk, but when they matched the castings of those tire tracks with Kunuk's pickup truck, the tire treads were not the same. Also, the Dodge pickup truck was more of a darker blue, not a light blue. When they asked Kunuk about the location where he was hunting, he was able to give them a concrete location where he killed the rabbit and the porcupine. Now I thought this was crazy, but Redburn actually drove the 75 miles to the campground and found the exact porcupine. So, Kunuk's crazy story was suddenly pretty believable. And that's interesting. I told you there were going to be twists and turns. When the DNA results came back, unbelievably, all the blood was animal blood. It did not belong to Sonia. Kunuk was innocent, and now investigators were back at square one. It had almost been a month, and Burrow and Cathcart went back to working on other cases in Anchorage, while Redburn and Wayofana were the only officers assigned to Sonia's case. Redburn worked the day shift. He was in charge of canvassing and interviewing people, while Wayofana worked the evening shift, talking to people at bars, writing reports, and on quiet nights, they went through the whole town looking for a light blue pickup truck or SUV with mismatched tires, and there were none. So, was it someone from out of town? That could make sense, but nobody had seen any newcomers on August 10th, and they usually stuck out in a small town like this one. But Sonia was last seen in the middle of the night, so maybe they weren't seen because they were just passing through, and this was a crime of opportunity. But why? If the act wasn't sexual, as it appeared, it could have been anything. It could have been an argument, or it could have been an attempted kidnapping. They just didn't know. By mid-September, Redburn led a volunteer search of a landfill to try to find Sonia's clothing. A large number of people came to help. They looked and they looked, but her clothes weren't there. At this point, since their search yielded very little results, if any, the two officers began to blame one another. Wayofana felt like Redburn wasn't communicative, and would leave out information, not telling him about important interviews that he had done. On the other hand, Redburn felt like Ivanoff wasn't pulling his weight on the case. But this is not the time to argue about these things. Teamwork is the only way that these investigations will work. Everyone was desperate for answers. Tom was still going by the police station, inquiring about his sister-in-law's case, and Ivanoff himself was a close family friend. So he took matters into his own hands. He decided to treat Sonia's case like he had never seen it before. He wanted to read every document in her case over again from the beginning. He was so committed. Then, at 4 a.m., after hours of sifting through evidence, Ivanoff found a handwritten note while reviewing Sonia's file. It described a tip that came in from a woman named Florence, who said that she had important information. Ivanoff couldn't figure out whose handwriting it was, so he tried to find notes about Florence, but it seemed like no one had ever followed up. Later that morning, he talked to Chief Ralph Taylor, and Taylor admitted he was the one who had taken that tip about Florence, but he said he wasn't able to get in touch with her. I can't help but think that's kind of strange in this very small town. How many Florences were there? But I also understand being pulled in many different directions. So, by mid-September, 4 weeks after Sonia had been found dead, Ivanoff took a day shift to track down and interview Florence. In a tape-recorded interview, Florence told Ivanoff and Taylor that she was so glad that someone finally contacted her. She repeated what she said the first time, that she had seen Sonia in the early morning hours of August 11th. She and her younger sister, Danita, were in their mom's house on 3rd Avenue, smoking cigarettes out on the porch, and that is when they saw Sonia walk by, heading west down 3rd Avenue. Danita had actually turned to Florence and said that that was Sonia Ivanoff. Danita was a sophomore basketball player at Nome High School, and everyone at Nome High School knew that Sonia played in city games. She was considered kind of like a local legend, and they thought she would end up getting a scholarship to play in the women's NCAA. So, Danita was excited, and she and Florence waved to Sonia. They even had a brief conversation, but at that point, the rain had started to pick up, and Sonia continued walking. It was dark, but Sonia was only about 20 feet away when they saw a car drive down 3rd Avenue from behind her, and then it slowed down to a crawl. As Florence and her sister watched, the car slowly followed Sonia, who didn't stop. The car then drove down West D Street and suddenly turned around and cut Sonia off as soon as she was getting to the intersection. Then, the driver rolled down the passenger side window, and Florence and Danita could overhear what Sonia said. She said, "What's going on?" And she stuck her head inside the car. She seemed to have some kind of conversation with the driver, and then they saw Sonia willingly get into the passenger seat and shut the door. Then the car took off northwest towards the airport. Florence tried to make out the car in the dark. She knew it was a white SUV with a dark blue decal on the side. It said Nome Police Department. She knew it did. It was obvious that this was a police vehicle. There was no mistake about it. So they wondered, was Sonia in trouble? Where were they going, and why? It was weird and scary enough that Florence asked Danita what time it was. She went and checked. It was 1:26 a.m., about 10 minutes since Sonia had last been seen by another witness near the gas station, and 30 minutes since she had left to head home. I looked at maps of Nome, and from what I can tell, the police car must have passed Sonia's home, making Florence wonder where they were going. Nobody lived northwest of town. The road the driver was taking led right into the tundra and intersected with Nome Highway, and we know Sonia was found in the tundra. As Ivanoff and Taylor heard Florence's story, they were shocked that she had the courage to come forward. Florence was afraid that giving this witness statement would put a target on her back. You never know if you get close to the truth, if someone is willing to do whatever it takes to silence you. It's very risky. The only problem was that Ivanoff and Taylor didn't believe Florence was telling them the whole truth. They trusted their fellow officers. They knew they would do the right thing, and witnesses can be wrong sometimes. It was dark and rainy, so a blue decal could have been something else. Also, the cop cars were painted white, not blue, and they knew there was blue paint at the crime scene. There were a total of 3 vehicles, each one was a little different. So they asked Florence tons of questions, including whether the car had an antenna or runners on the side. She said it had lights on the top, but she couldn't remember any other details. It was the best lead that they had at the time, and Taylor knew that an accusation against the local police department meant that the case was out of their hands. Taylor reached back out to the ABI state troopers and said a witness provided a tip that pointed to their department possibly knowing something about Sonia's case. Well, as it turned out, the ABI officer Randy McFerrin had actually received a tape recording in the mail from Florence, and he got it the same day. She had gone out of her way to record a video of herself explaining what she had just told these 2 officers. She said the local police didn't follow up. The fact that Florence recorded her statement was a sign that this was very serious. She witnessed something that scared her, and she needed to report it. Even though she felt like she was putting herself out there, it was important enough for her to come forward. Eric Burrows returned to head the case. It was immediately obvious to the people of Nome that the Alaska Bureau was back, and rumors were flying around town. Christina, Tom, and Tamer weren't given any information about what was happening, and when asked, the Nome Police Department just told the papers and the media that the state troopers were just there because they had more resources to help solve Sonia's case. But they didn't admit anything about a Nome officer possibly being involved in some way. Burrows interviewed Florence and Danita separately. He asked Florence to take him to her mom's house and show him exactly where the police car picked Sonia up. He asked Danita to confirm Florence's story, and then he asked both of them if Sonia appeared drunk, just in case the officer had to pick her up because she was intoxicated. But both women insisted Sonia was completely sober. So why would she be getting into a police car? Was she offered a ride home? Was she threatened? And if it had been an officer, why wouldn't they have come forward with this information? But it made sense if the killer was an officer, based on what I told you about evidence awareness and access to a unique .22 caliber bullet like the one they found that was used to kill Sonia. But many people had guns in Alaska, and none of the officers owned a light blue pickup or SUV. The 3 police vehicles were white Ford Expeditions, which didn't match up with the tire tracks or the paint at the crime scene. Burrows looked into the 3 vehicles, which were named by numbers on the license plates. There was vehicle 321, 322, and 983. 321 and 322 were basic police vehicles with Nome Police Department decals on the side. The 983 was a newer model, which had dark running boards on the sides and a 911 sticker on the back. None of the 7 officers owned a take-home police vehicle. When these shared vehicles weren't being driven by the 2 officers that were on duty every night, they were left outside the station with a key in the ignition, ready to go in an emergency. So technically, anyone could have taken one of these cars. Each vehicle had an expensive shotgun kept in a locked box in the trunk. The key was left in the lock again, in case they needed to use the guns quickly. Well, there's another way that someone besides an officer could have gotten a hold of a police weapon. However, the doors to the vehicles were always locked, and the only way to open the door without a key was an electronic keypad. You had to know the password, so that does change things, unless there was a way to gain access to a code. But it was important to rule out the officers. So if Sonia had been picked up in a police vehicle, it would have been driven by one of the 2 officers on duty that night at 1 a.m. on Monday morning. That would have been either Matt Owens driving car 322 or Stan Piscoya driving 983. These guys were considered upstanding citizens and officers. They both served for 3 years on the Nome Police Department. Officer Owens was a firearms expert from Florida, and Officer Piscoya was raised in Nome and had experience at correctional facilities. Owens had a 4-year-old kid, and Piscoya was a referee at the City League basketball games. But now let's just point to anything negative as well. Officer Owens was the one who told Tom not to hang Sonia's photo on the wall, and Piskoya had been the one to kind of gaslight Tamara when she reported her best friend missing. Obviously, it could have also been any of the other officers since there was a third police vehicle, but Burroughs figured it would be best to start with these two. He really didn't want to stir the pot and ruin the police officers' reputations and integrity by interviewing the entire station, so he kept everything on the down low, flying them out to Anchorage to talk to them. I don't see why sending them all the way to Anchorage would prevent any rumors, but I guess they got to do what they got to do. I know how important it is for a community not to lose trust in their officers. So, Owens and Piskoya were given plane tickets to Anchorage for the morning of September 24th. But before they could leave, something crazy happened that led right back to Sonia's case. At 12:46 am, the early morning hours of the 23rd, Officer Redburn and Officer Owens were on duty when Officer Owens radioed in and said police car 321 was missing. Someone had stolen it from the parking lot. Neither of them could figure out how it was stolen unless someone knew that electronic passcode. That's interesting. So maybe someone did know the code somehow. I mean, this is a small town and people talk. It turns out these Ford Expeditions, these police vehicles, are pretty expensive, and the shotguns in the back are also worth a lot of money and they're dangerous. So Redburn sent out some state troopers to search for the vehicle, as well as Chief Taylor. Owens went searching, while Redburn stayed at the station waiting to respond if there was any kind of emergency. 2 hours later, Owens radioed Redburn and said he found the stolen vehicle. It was in a place called Bessie Pit. This is a sand and gravel mine 5 minutes from Nome. Here it is on the map, about a quarter of a mile away from where Sonia was found. This was at 2:51 a.m., and everyone stopped their search, and the night was quiet. Then, just minutes later, at 2:53 a.m., Owens yelled over the radio that he needed backup. Now, shots had been fired. Redburn and Taylor responded in their separate vehicles, and when they got there, Owens was standing in the middle of the main road, completely unharmed but shaken up. He told Redburn and Taylor that he'd seen vehicle 321 at Bessie Pit, and the brake lights were on. He pulled up, he walked behind the car, and that's when he was ambushed. 2 shots rang out, glass shattered, and he took cover. By the time he looked up, the shooter was running into the tundra. Owens couldn't make out the shooter's features, and he wasn't sure exactly which direction he had gone because he was traumatized. He told Taylor that the shots made him realize if he died, his 4-year-old son wouldn't have a father, and now he was questioning whether the police lifestyle even suited him at all. It's not every day that a small-town cop is dealing with an unsolved murder and being shot at. Well, law enforcement did a full perimeter search of the gravel pit, and they couldn't find the shooter. One of the 321's windows was completely shattered, and the vehicle was towed for processing. It took the rest of the day to find out all the details. The Remington 870 shotgun that was usually locked in the back of 321 was missing. Someone had stolen it. However, Taylor did a full sweep at Bessie Pit, and he found no bullet shells. None. Shotgun shells are pretty big, so unless the perpetrator had time to pick them up or had brought his own revolver, what Owens remembered had to be incorrect. So, they tried to reenact Owens' story of the shootout, but it felt logically impossible. Owens was highly trained in weapons and would know exactly what to do when faced with a criminal shooting at him. The fact that he had no details about his attacker, including how tall they were, even estimates, just felt off. But at the same time, remember, these are the officers that are supposed to be investigating Sonia's murder in regard to one of the cops being involved. So they could have had a little bit of negative bias here. But upon further inspection, there were no fingerprints to be found on the driver's seat of the vehicle. This is normal when searching cars. There aren't a lot of places that it's easy to take fingerprints. When the ABI criminalist looked at the broken window, she found glass all over the seat. Someone had smashed it in from the outside, or so it seemed. So that was a little bit interesting. However, just wait, there is more. Underneath the glass, she found an envelope, and when they opened it, it contained a rec center pool pass that belonged to Sonia. The last time Tamer saw Sonia, she was carrying her wallet, which contained all of her IDs. Why was it in this cop car, in an envelope? The criminalist showed this to Redburn, and he thought this was directly out of a movie. If the killer wanted to flaunt, he would have left a note, right? Well, guess what? There was a typed-out note in this envelope. I'm gonna read it to you. It was titled Pig. Then in one typed paragraph, it read, "I hate cops. I hate every one of you. Sonia was just a person in the wrong place at the wrong time. I did not know her. As you can see, it's easy for me to take your pig car keys right there. It was not her fault that she thought I was a pig, and just happened. She was just a person, and I just wanted to see if I could. That night, every one of you should be more careful. I watch every move you make. You leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. I'll also shoot you in the head if you get close." Now this note wasn't signed by anyone, and no name was left behind to pinpoint who this letter was from. This note was analyzed for DNA, but it turned up nothing. The FBI took a look as well, since they're trained in analyzing written and typed threats. The FBI profiler said he thought this letter and the shootout could have been staged to take the heat off of the two officers that were accused of being involved. But the profiler also thought that the perpetrator could be a police officer. It was possible for someone to steal a cop car, but the motivation "I hate cops" didn't seem like a solid foundation as to why they would steal the car. Now, literally the day before Owens and Piskoia were supposed to be interviewed in Anchorage, the timing was interesting, for sure. But then again, if they had stolen the car before, what was stopping them from stealing it again? Referring to the police as pigs was a deliberate choice, and the profile thought maybe this was to throw them off track. This gave them probable cause that the 321 incident, as they're calling it, could have been staged and created as a diversion to stop the interviews from going forward. The FBI profiler kind of thought the opposite about everything in the letter. For example, the words, "I did not know her," were seen as an actual connection, an implied level of familiarity between the perpetrator and Sonia, not the other way around. We already know from Florence's testimony that Sonia had leaned into the vehicle to talk to someone she was comfortable and familiar enough with to even get inside the vehicle. It does make sense. Why would she get in the car if it wasn't one of the 7 officers from town that were driving? The very next day following this incident was the 24th of September, when Owens and Piskoia were scheduled to do their interviews and polygraphs out in Anchorage. Owens was so shook up that he asked Chief Taylor if he could stay home and get therapy. He had a rough night, and Taylor agreed, so he got on the plane the next day instead. He was sent to an in-house police psychologist. But Officer Stan Piskoia did make it to that interview, and they gathered his version of what happened on the night in question. Piskoia saw Sonia all the time at the basketball games. He knew she was, so could he have been the officer that stopped her that night in Anchorage? Piskoia was compliant in his interview. When asked what car he drove on the night of August 10th, he said that he couldn't remember because they aren't designated to a specific vehicle. They just hop in whatever one's available. But he said it was probably the newer Expedition. However, they do keep a logbook of which cars they drove, and investigators confirmed that was true. The logbook showed he drove vehicle 983. When questioned about whether he remembered anything specific about the night, he said that he had patrolled before midnight, and at 12:53, he and Owens responded to a 911 call about a domestic altercation. The two of them had to deal with a very violent man who actually hit Owen in the jaw because he could not be subdued until Piskoia sprayed him with pepper spray. The assailant was then taken to jail, and following this incident, Piskoia did all his paperwork at the station and finished everything by about 1:45 a.m. there. This means his alibi was that he was sitting alone at the Nome Police Station with no one to confirm he was there. Piskoia said they could check the police log, which had handwritten records, but he wrote from 1:10 to 1:45 a.m., but these can totally be faked, so this wasn't a solid alibi. But Piskoya insisted he and Owens were innocent. He agreed to a polygraph test, which we know is not concrete evidence, but he did pass, which convinced investigators that he was not their primary suspect at the moment, though that alone was not enough to clear this man. Back in Nome, Burrow interviewed the other 5 officers of the Nome Police Department and learned more about Piskoya and Owens' reputations. Piskoya came from a good family, and people liked him a lot. Owens was also well-liked and was a top-tier officer. He was great with firearms. However, some of his fellow officers did say there were moments when he didn't exactly act rationally in high-pressure situations. Owens had actually specifically signed up for night shifts because they were easier. And remember, he was just questioning whether this line of work was even for him, after what happened a couple of nights before this at the sand pit. Other officers said he had a history of inviting friends into his vehicle in the passenger seat of his police cruiser. Owens was reprimanded multiple times for this, and I always thought you were allowed to go on ride-alongs, but apparently, it isn't legal to bring friends around in cop cars unless it's authorized. But that didn't stop Owens from doing it. Apparently, from the rumors swirling around, there were times where he would sort of pick up women, asking them if they wanted to go for a little joyride in his police car, and that at times this even resulted in relationships or even sex. Interestingly, this sounds a lot like what could have happened to Sonia that night, minus the sex part, I guess. Apparently, Owens also invited his girlfriends and dates into his car. I'm guessing this is to impress the ladies. Even though these are rumors, Burrows wasn't sure about cop car sex being consensual or even allowed. You're not supposed to be doing that, especially if you're on duty. It could indicate that Owens was using his badge to back up predatory behavior, almost like forcing women into doing something because he has authority. And that didn't sit right. Burrows found out that Sonia worked nights at the hospital front desk, meaning Owens would have interacted with her if he took patients to the hospital. He could have even targeted her. Secondly, he learned that Chief Taylor never told Owens that he could skip his flight to Anchorage to go get therapy, so Owens was lying about that. Third, Owens had turned up at Sonia's crime scene the night of August 13th in his personal vehicle to investigate, along with Anna Redburn and Taylor. His presence was never officially requested. He wasn't on duty until the night shift that day, and he hadn't been called over the radio. So why did he come there? Furthermore, how did Owens find out where Sonia was? Did someone tell him? Was it Piska, or could he have something to do with her murder and pretended he was helping solve her case? After 5 whole days, Owens finally flew out to Anchorage to be interviewed by the ABI on September 29th. He corroborated Piska's story that they patrolled and did paperwork, subdued a man who was hurting his wife, and that Owens had been hit so hard in his jaw that his hat and his glasses flew off. Owens took the guy to jail and recorded the time in the dispatch log. He said it was around 1 a.m. Then he said he met up with his friend, Terry Candelli, who rode in the passenger seat of his police car from about 1:10 a.m. to 1:20. Afterward, he patrolled the bars during closing time in case any violence broke out. At 2:30 in the morning, he met up with Piska to finish up paperwork, and at 2:50, Owens drove Piska home. Then he returned to the station, did some reports, and then heard a gunshot at 3:30 a.m. Owens said he drove around for an hour trying to figure out where the shot had come from. Then he got a call from dispatch and dealt with another case. At 7 a.m., Owens switched cars with the sergeant and went home to go to sleep. When asked if he ever picked up Sonia that night, he stated that Sonia had never been inside his patrol car or his personal car, never. He also insisted that neither he nor Officer Piska had anything to do with this. In the interview, Owens said he knew of Sonia, but he didn't know her personally. He had never spoken to her before and hadn't seen her on the night of August 10th. He did admit that his friends and some women he had dated had definitely ridden with him in his police car, but he never picked up women. The investigator mentioned the rumors, and he did get defensive. He said, "Why are we talking about my sex life?" Fair enough, I guess. But then again, if he picked up girls, and he picked up Sonia, that would be relevant. but the investigator decided to switch tactics because he had to keep pressing him. He asked Owens about what they referred to as the 321 incident, the early morning on August 23rd when police car 321 was missing and Owens got shot at. Owens elaborated and said he was driving along the highway, looking for 321, when he saw brake lights. He stopped behind the cop car in his personal car and noticed that the trunk of the Ford Expedition was open and the shotgun wasn't there. He walked up to the passenger side of the vehicle, and that is when he was shot at and had to duck for cover. The perpetrator then ran into the tundra, never to be seen again. The investigator pointed out some things that he thought were interesting. First of all, we all know that brake lights are only on when someone has their foot on the brake. So they were trying to understand how the trunk was open, the brake lights were on, and the gun was already out of the trunk if the perpetrator hadn't even seen anyone coming yet. The other thing they thought was interesting was that if he was shot at, he probably would have been injured. He probably would have been hit since he was in such close range. This perpetrator, apparently from the letter, didn't like cops. They also thought it was interesting that this person ran into the tundra, where people can literally die of exposure and animal attacks. He ran into this landscape of rusty gold mine equipment in the dark, which is a very dangerous place for any sane person to go. That's why the investigators thought this wasn't a person at all. It was all staged. Owens actually said, "Are you implying that I staged it?" The investigator actually said, "Yeah." The reason the investigator thought that Owens may be responsible for Sonia's murder in the staged 321 event is because he left a good hour unaccounted for the night in question. From about 1:20 to 2:20. He doesn't have a solid alibi for that time frame. And that's around the time when Florence said she saw someone pick up Sonia in the police car. Then his report of hearing a gunshot around 3:30 and pretty spievy meant that Sonia could have been killed at 3:30. But how would he have heard a shot from 5 minutes away? They estimate the sound of a normal gunshot only travels about 2 miles. So these things, coupled with the timing of the incident of the 321 car, which happened to be hours before Owens was supposed to be interviewed, made it look suspicious. Plus, back in Nome, Burroughs had tracked down several women who admitted to having sex with Owens in his patrol car while he was on duty. But Owens swore that he never ever picked up a woman while he was on duty. He called that just crazy. So the investigator put Owens through a polygraph test, just like with Pisca. However, unlike Pisca, he failed. When Owens realized, he just said, but mostly that was when they were asking him about the 321 incident. Even if it was staged, it didn't prove that he killed Sonia, but maybe he knew something, and he was trying to cover it up. Maybe he had picked her up and then dropped her off, and now he was trying to remove the guilt from his shoulders. But that didn't explain the pig's note, which, if written by Owens, was somewhat of a confession. At the end, there was nothing to charge him with, so he went back to his apartment and was put on administrative leave until the ABI could either prove he was responsible or rule him out. Burroughs talked to Owens' soon-to-be ex-wife, Tren. The two of them were in the middle of a divorce at the time that this was happening. Tren told Burroughs that on Tuesday, August 12th, it was Officer Matt Owens' birthday, and he was taking care of their son. Let's just call him Danny. Matt called Tren at 4:30 p.m. Mentuo asked if he could possibly drop Danny off because there was a girl missing, and he wasn't sure if it would turn out okay. He wanted to go and help. Tren knew Matt's police work was very important to him, so she agreed to watch their son, even though she had to work that night as well. Now she remembers having to try to find someone to care for Danny, but here's why this information stood out. Because at 4:30 p.m. on Tuesday, Tamar hadn't even gone to the police station yet. She had called, but there wouldn't have been a missing persons report filed for another 45 minutes. Tren also said that the night of September 23rd, less than a day after the 321 incident, Owens told her that the police suspected him of Sonia's murder, but that there was a note on the passenger seat that cleared him of suspicion. But nobody told him he was cleared of suspicion, and why would he be excited about being cleared? All of this seems premature, like he knows things before they happen. Could he have crafted the note to clear himself of suspicion? That's what they wondered. So Burroughs kept digging, and one woman came forward and said that she went on a date with Owens in September, and he told her about his plans to actually leave Alaska. He'd asked her to go with him, and it sounded like some kind of getaway plan. Burroughs realized he was running out of time. He needed to get Owens behind bars in case he was trying to leave the state, and disappeared before they could clear him or pin this murder on him. 7 other people in Nome confirmed that Owens knew Sonia personally, even though he insisted they never spoke more than a few words at the hospital front desk. But this next piece of evidence is what really set things in motion. A local guy named Warren Little, who knew Owens from church, told Burroughs that in the days after Sonia's body was found, Matt confided in him about what happened to Sonia. Days afterward, Owens told Warren an evil guy had picked Sonia up from the side of the road using a police vehicle. As soon as she realized what his intentions were, she jumped out of the car to get away from him, and that's when he shot her with a handgun. Matt told Warren there were no signs of sexual violence and no DNA evidence found at the crime scene. Now, how did Matt know this? Because the autopsy results didn't come in until August 25th. Matt wasn't even assigned to this case. This gave Burroughs the probable cause to put out a warrant for Owens' arrest. He was actually fired on Friday, October 24th, and arrested on Saturday at 7 p.m. His arraignment was the very next day, and most of the city of Nome was there. Tom and Christina went there with a group from their town, and they of course received really cold and passive-aggressive looks and comments. Several members of Owens' church said that he could never be responsible for murder. They loved him, but they didn't know all the details of this investigation. Even Tamer didn't want to believe that Owens was responsible because cops are supposed to protect you from criminals, and if Owens was the criminal, then you can't trust these people who swore to protect you. Burroughs continued to look for even more concrete evidence, something more than just witness or hearsay confessions. Police car 321 turned out to have no DNA evidence connecting Owens to the crime. And even though the ink on the note matched up with the same paper and ink of a printer that Owens could have had access to, other cops did as well. However, they did find that Remington shotgun, and it was processed for DNA, but again, there was no evidence tying it to Owens. They wondered if there was any weapon belonging to Owens that shot .22 caliber bullets. The shotgun's bullets were too big, they were not the ones that killed Sonia, and no one's service weapon was a .45 Glock. His personal car wasn't blue, so something wasn't adding up. An investigation isn't over until all the biggest questions are answered and everything makes sense, and they just weren't there yet. They wondered, could they have the wrong guy? The ABI returned to Dredge 5 Road, wondering if they could have overlooked a bullet shell. It was fall, there was snow on the ground, and there was so much brush that they had to hack it away. They were able to find a bullet shell in the brush, indicating the gun used was an automatic and not a revolver. Based on the close range of the shot, it was probably not a rifle either. This narrowed it down to a handgun like a pistol, and the unique grooves in the bullet didn't point to any guns used in police firearms training. So, whose gun was this? It was Redburn who suggested that maybe Burroughs should look in their police evidence room. Inside, they kept confiscated guns in evidence boxes. Every known police officer knew the lock key was kept in an open mailbox belonging to a sergeant, so everyone in the station had access to this. Owens could have walked in, used a gun, and put it back without anyone knowing. Sure enough, in one of the evidence boxes was a Jennings .22 pistol. It had a similar rifling pattern to the bullet that killed Sonia. The gun, along with the bullet shell, was processed for DNA. With Owens arrested, they put a call out for tips, hoping anyone who was scared of him would now come forward, and they did. In his 3 years working for the Nome Police Department, 6 women reported they had been coerced into entering his vehicle and performing sexual acts on him. 2 women said it happened multiple times while he was on duty in his patrol car, and one said she was threatened at gunpoint and forced into oral sex. Over time, the incidents got worse and worse, and several women filed complaints with the Nome Police Department, but no one believed them. These women would be arrested for something like being publicly intoxicated, and once they were in his vehicle, he knew he had authority over them. He apparently would threaten them and get what he wanted. In fact, Owens told one woman, "No one will believe a drunk Alaska native over a police officer." His words, and that disgusts me. Anyone who abuses their power like this is disgusting. I totally understand why many of these women did not want to come forward until this man was behind bars, especially if he had threatened to harm them. Authority figures taking advantage of others is all too common. We see it happen all the time, whether it's a trusted adult, even a family member, clergy at a church, a teacher, and the list goes on. This also shows you that sometimes victims are telling the truth, even if it appears that the person they're accusing looks like an upstanding citizen. It's important that victims are taken seriously when they do come forward to report these incidents. In a case like this, when someone in a position of authority, or anyone for that matter, is preying on a woman who's intoxicated, he needs to be held accountable. Despite all these women coming forward against Matt Owens for sexually violating them, the puzzle pieces still were not lining up. They were all still alive, but maybe that's because they complied, and Sonia wouldn't. But the Jennings .22 pistol had no DNA evidence either, and neither did the bullet shell. Burroughs and the crime lab analyst were frustrated by the dead ends. Wait until you hear this. One analyst spent a day looking through parking lots all throughout Nome, trying to make a list of cars with mismatched tires. They'd done this before, but who knows? Maybe they would get lucky this time. It turned out most vehicles in Nome had mismatched tires because people would replace one when a tire popped. There was rugged terrain all around, and they didn't always buy the same exact brand, or one was newer, so it had more distinctive tread. The analyst categorized hundreds of vehicles before he found a light blue truck with one mismatched tread. It belonged to a guy named Benjamin Niles, who worked in a scrapyard selling miscellaneous items, but lived far outside Nome and wasn't in town very often. They intercepted and interviewed this man about his whereabouts on August 11th. Ben said he wasn't in Nome on the 11th, but on the 12th, he said he spent the day in Nome with his girlfriend. They ate lunch at a local restaurant, and he even had the receipt in his wallet, which confirmed that he had been in Nome at noon and paid for 2 meals. But what about later that night? Where was he then? Was he anywhere near the tundra, and if so, why? Well, Ben claimed he and his girlfriend drove home in the evening when it was still light outside. Remember, this would be the same evening that Sonia's body was found. But before officers located her, he said they took the North Road out of Nome and turned onto Dredge 5 Road because his girlfriend had to go to the bathroom. Of course, there are no businesses to stop at out there, so he said he pulled off the road and further into the bushes to give her some privacy. After that, they drove home. Ben said he didn't know anything about Sonia or her murder, and he hadn't seen her body or anyone out there that night, so he's saying he pulled up right where someone had been murdered, but he doesn't see anything. It seemed like that was way too much of a coincidence to pull into that exact area. But it might also explain why there was so little DNA evidence at the crime scene if this was a quick hit, and Ben just left town after he committed this crime. But then again, what would be his motive? It would be highly unlikely that Ben's girlfriend would support him in murdering someone unless she was covering for him. So Burroughs was again stumped. He called in the head of homicide at the Anchorage Police Department, Bill Ford. Now G. Ford flew to Nome to look at all this evidence, and he noticed from the pictures of Sonia's body, remember this, there were leaves on her back, and dirt had dried in specific patterns on her body. This was consistent with rainwater hitting her shoulder. It rained on August 11th from 12 a.m. to 5 p.m. It did not rain on the 12th, meaning Sonia had been killed before the 12th and before Ben got to town. When Ben had rolled his truck through the place where Sonia was shot, the blood had mixed with the dirt, and it created a clay-like texture that was perfect for tire tracks. His story checked out. This man was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The tire tracks and the blue paint on that branch were not related to this crime, and that just breaks my heart. They went in all these directions looking for those specific things, when it turns out it had nothing to do with Sonia's murder. But they still needed more evidence linking Matt to this crime. At the beginning of November, a local woman responded to a call for tips. She said she also dated Matt Owens before Sonia was killed, and one of their last dates was around August 17th, which would have been just a few days after Sonia was killed. She said that Owens took her camping in the mountains in a hunting area called Coffee Creek. This is 75 miles north of Nome, and I wondered if this is the same area that Kunuk went for his hunting trip, because where he was a similar distance. This place was very popular. The tiny cabins were just off of Carrick Road. This woman that Evans took out there said that he started a fire out back, and she found it very romantic until she went to bed, and Owens didn't follow her because he was outside getting rid of some garbage, burning it. However, she thought this was weird because when she looked, he was burning clothing that looked new. At the time, she really didn't think twice about it, and she didn't report it to authorities. The police already knew what Sonia was wearing that night, Skechers and jeans. So they hoped that this would be the big break they needed. On November 5th, they drove to that campsite and they located the fire pit. Burroughs painstakingly dug up everything in that pit and mixed the ashes and charcoal with water. The ashes would dissolve and then reveal anything that wasn't able to burn. He said it was like panning for gold, and he ended up finding a metal eyelet which would hold a shoelace. It was corroded from the flames, but when he looked at it closely, he could make out the word Skechers, even though just barely. He transferred the contents of the fire pit back to Nome using a big tarp, and they combed through the remnants. Burroughs found a dozen Skechers eyelets from where shoelaces would have been on a shoe. He also found metal hooks, underwire of a bra, a metal piece that attached to a belt, the metal button from a pair of Tilt brand jeans, a jean zipper, and a key ring with 4 charred keys on it. They wouldn't have found any of this if it weren't for that woman who came forward bravely with this tip. Burrough called Sonia's sister, Christina, and she asked her to identify anything she could. She said Sonia regularly wore a pair of brown Tilt brand jeans, and Tamer also confirmed that those were the branded jeans Sonia wore. Of course, she was wearing Tamer's Skechers brand shoes. But out of everything they found in that fire pit, the keys were the most incriminating piece of evidence. One of them looked similar to Sonia's apartment key, and when they made a replica and tested it, it fit inside the lock. Now it wouldn't open the door because it was damaged. However, another key fit into a P.O. box at the Nome post office, and that P.O. box belonged to Michael Owens, which is Officer Matt Owens' uncle. That was his mistake. When he was getting rid of incriminating evidence, he also burned some of his own personal belongings, maybe even by accident, and he also brought a woman out there while he did it. Burroughs and the state prosecutors were confident that they now had enough evidence to convict Matt of Sonia's murder. Alaska was one of the first states to actually abolish the death penalty, but the FBI considered charging him at the federal level so that they could still give the family that option. One of Sonia's brothers anonymously said that he wanted Owens to be electrocuted for what he had done, but Matt ended up being tried at the state level, so no death penalty. He was held at the Anvil Mountain Correctional Institution on a $500,000 bail, but he had so much support from the members of his church that he was released on house arrest after just 2 months, and that's very disheartening. Owens continued to live in his rental home in Anchorage Hillside for the next year. The home was owned by his friend Terry's wife, Charlotte Candelli. I'm saying you've heard Terry's name, this is his wife. Anchorage Hillside was one of the wealthiest areas of Nome. It had the best view, and I can't imagine what that would have been like for all the women that he hurt, as well as Sonia's friends and family, to know that Matt Owens was out of jail and just living it up. I'm sure it didn't bode well. The trial was held in Nome, on January 18th of 2005. Prosecutor Rick Suby brought forward 70 witnesses, including the 3 people that Sonia passed on her way home: Rena, Lamb, and Florence. You already heard what they told police, but there were some things that kind of contradicted what they said. Florence stated that the car that picked up Sonia didn't have running boards, so it wasn't police vehicle 983 that was driven by Piscoya. But the thing was, she never mentioned that in her first statement. Rena testified that long after she saw Sonia walking home, she saw Officer Owens driving around Nome between the hours of 2:30 and 3 o'clock that morning. On the stand, she said someone was sitting in the passenger seat next to him, even though she didn't see who it was. But this contradicted her original statement. She said in 2003 that she didn't know if there was someone in the passenger seat because she was so focused on figuring out which officer was the driver. And you know, when there are contradictions or any discrepancies, the defense attorney is going to jump on it. One of the things that defense attorney James Momis argued was about the gun. He said that the Jennings .22 did not match up with the .22 caliber bullet they found, so it couldn't be the murder weapon. And as much as courts have upheld bullet station marks as concrete evidence, it's actually not an exact science, so there is room for reasonable doubt. Plus, there's also a witness that claimed he had seen Sonia alive on Monday, driving a blue pickup truck, and she sped past him. Then later that day, that's when he saw a missing persons flyer, and he was shocked because he was like, "I just saw her driving a car." Then there was the owner of the post office. He testified there was no way Matt could have a copy of his uncle's key because that wasn't allowed. He said it is illegal to make a copy of a P.O. box key, but maybe he stole it, who knows. These things do bring in reasonable doubt though. Then Owens' ex-wife testified, and she said that Owens responded to the missing persons report on Tuesday the 11th, 45 minutes before the report was filed. But Owens himself took the stand in his own defense, and as part of his testimony, he said that his ex-wife's memory was faulty, that it was actually Tuesday the 19th at 4:30 p.m., and he was doing an evidence search, not a search for Sonia and her body. Their biggest argument and defense was that he was not the officer involved. They pinned everything on another officer, Byron Redburn. And I have to say, this argument is pretty convincing. After all, Redburn was the one corresponding with the Alaska State Troopers. He was also the one who suggested that Burroughs go to the evidence room to look for the murder weapon. Additionally, he had a motive to blame everything on Owens, because Owens had an affair with Redburn's daughter, Jennifer. Owens also witnessed Redburn punch someone while on duty and reported this assault to other officers. It was argued that Redburn was mad at Owens, mad that Owens snitched on him, and mad that he slept with his daughter. So, Redburn had been the one to stage the 3-1 incident because he was also on duty that night. He staged everything to pin it on Matt Owens. Now, this might have been enough to sway the jury, but Owens did admit to talking to Sonia with other officers before her murder. Apparently, they had a disagreement on whether or not she was 21, so he looked her up on the police computer. But why did it matter if she wasn't 21? The fact that he was looking her up online gave him more of a motive, like he had been targeting her. Remember, he liked to approach intoxicated women and try to take advantage of them. However, the jury never got to hear from the 6 women who came forward about their sexual incidents with Owens because their testimonies were not deemed admissible in court. The jury was divided. Half of them were friends with Owens and his family, while the other half were friends with Sonia and her family. After 40 hours of deliberation, they were unable to come to a decision. It was a mistrial, and they had to go through all of this all over again. Sonia's parents, Larry and Maggie, who were there every step of the way, said that having to go through this again was something they wouldn't wish on anyone. Sonia's brother Jacob didn't think the Nome trial was fair in the first place. He knew that half the jurors were Owens' church buddies. He hoped that the next trial would be moved. The lawyers petitioned for it to be set in Anchorage or Fairbanks, where the victim and the accused would be more anonymous, anywhere but Nome. But the judge decided on Kotzebue, a smaller town in Alaska with an even smaller population but more neutral jurors. Long it was for all the investigators, police officers, and the family. But the trial went virtually the same way. However, when the defense began their testimonies, Burroughs got a call from Ivanoff, who was still in Nome. Apparently, Ivanoff was having a casual conversation with one of his neighbors, D. Blackshear. D asked, "Did it ever come up in trial that Charlotte Sandrelli saw Sonia's ID in Matt's bedroom?" Now recall, she was the one renting Owens a room after he and his wife separated. So this is where he would have been staying at the time of Sonia's murder. Waya's mouth just dropped open and he told Burroughs immediately. Burroughs took the first flight back to Nome to talk to Dee about Charlotte. Dee told Burroughs that he was talking to Charlotte a week after Sonia's death when she mentioned seeing a woman's wallet in the living room as well as Sonia's rec center ID card. Burroughs knew he needed Charlotte's testimony for this trial, but she was never going to go against Matt. She was friends with him. So he got a warrant to record a phone call between Dee and Charlotte. In the recording, you can hear Dee say to Charlotte, "You know the conversation, remember? You were concerned that you had seen, along with Matt's other stuff, Sonia's ID or rec card." Charlotte replied that she never told anyone about it. She figured if Owens did have the ID, then the cops would already know about it. But remember, the same rec card was eventually found in an envelope on the seat of the so-called stolen 321 car. There was no reason why it should have been in Matt's possession. Over the phone, Charlotte said she had no idea why Matt had the ID, but she never denied telling Dee that she had seen it. Despite all this work, they were denied the opportunity to allow her to testify. However, later on, when Owens was being cross-examined, he denied ever owning Sonia's ID, and the prosecution was able to bring Charlotte in as a rebuttal witness. But she never said she saw the ID. Now on the stand, she claimed she never saw it. She never saw Sonia's ID or wallet. In response to this, the prosecution played the taped conversation. It appeared as though she was lying at some point, either about seeing it in the first place or while on the stand. This was quite a mess, but at the end of the day, there was too much pointing in Owens's direction. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence by staging a cop car robbery. In December 2005, he received 101 years in prison. At the end of this entire ordeal, Sonia's parents cried justice was served, even though Owens' family and his church were still in denial. They thought he was innocent. Owens appealed his sentence over and over again, in 2010, 2015, 2016, 2021, and he'll probably do it again. Sonia's family continues to go to every appeal hearing. Tom says he isn't sure how Larry stands reliving his daughter's death, but Larry will do whatever it takes to make sure that Matt stays in prison until the end of his days. Sonia's mother, Maggie, said she will never trust a police officer again, and Sonia's brother says that no amount of justice will ever make up for Sonia's loss or the amount of suffering caused by a failed justice system. Women had come to the Nome Police Department with stories of Owens' cruelty, and they were turned away. His co-workers knew he was dangerous, and they didn't do anything about it. Chief of Police Taylor ended up stepping down in January of 2004. And the new chief of police did his best to sweep everything under the rug. He paid out settlements to any indigenous women who had sued the city of Nome. Young women disappear in Alaska more than anywhere else in the United States. 4 in 5 American and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence in their lifetimes, and Nome is still a very dangerous place for indigenous women. From 2008 to 2017, only 8% of the calls reporting sexual violence against indigenous women resulted in charges. There have been hundreds of women taken advantage of, and there's no doubt that Sonia was one of them. It's a long process of rebuilding trust, and the police department's reputation suffered for one man's evil actions. Tamer's report was laughed at. Florence's tip fell through the cracks. In more recent news, an officer in the Nome Police Department told dozens of women that he was working on their cases, including a 911 dispatcher herself, and then he never provided them with case numbers. Despite all this, the department is still trying to improve. It hired more officers and even a native victim advocate in 2007. The Sonia Ivanoff Act was signed into law, mandating that any officer who committed murder on duty would be sentenced to 99 years in prison. But the stories of violence against women perpetrated by the justice system are proof that stories like this need to be told so there can be change. I want to tell you what Burroughs thinks happened that night. Owens spent weeks targeting young women, including Sonia, something he regularly did with the resources that he had at his disposal. That night, he caught Sonia walking home from what he thought was the bar. His MO was to approach intoxicated, vulnerable women and manipulate them into getting into his vehicle by pushing them with his authority. He tried this with Sonia, thinking she was drunk, but she wasn't. Then he made his routine sexual advances, but Sonia resisted. Owens came prepared with the Jennings .22 pistol to threaten anyone who wouldn't comply. This may have worked in the past, and he was smart enough to use a weapon that wasn't his service one. When he suggested that Sonia have sex with him and she refused, he forced himself on her, and she fought back. Burroughs believes that Sonia most likely threatened to tell everyone in Nome that a 28-year-old cop was trying to prey on a drunk 19-year-old girl while on the job. When Owens realized the amount of power she now had, he got afraid. He thought she would tell on him, and people would actually believe her. Sonia was credible, respected, and loved by her community, and he was evil. The only way to keep his secret was to kill her. He reached across the passenger seat and hit her, which caused bruising to the left side of her face. Then, he took control of her while he drove them out of town. Owens murdered Sonia on that dirt road, covered up the evidence, and staged stealing the car to distract the police from the truth. I think this shows you how strong Sonia was. She stood up for herself, and she brought a voice to many women who had been silenced and to future women that Owens would have tried to prey on. It's just sad that she had to lose her life for it. Sonia will never have her own children, but her nieces and nephews are now growing up. Sarah, Gabby, and Ethan have been raised fishing, hunting, playing basketball, and looking over their shoulders. Gabby says she talks to Sonia's spirit all the time and asks her for guidance. As for Tamar, she left college because there were too many uniformed officers, and she got PTSD from the entire experience. She will never trust law enforcement again, for good reason. She lives in Unalakleet with her daughter, who was born on April 12th, just a day before Sonia's birthday. Tamar's daughter is just as tall and goofy as Sonia, and they share the same name. She named her daughter after her best friend. That's part of their culture, the culture that Sonia embraced. Bonnie was an 18-year-old college student who was last seen making her way to the bus stop one September morning in 1994. However, she never showed up to her class, and she didn't make it home that night. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that her mother got the news. The police had found Bonnie, and it wasn't good. This is her story. We're talking about Bonnie Christine Craig. She was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, on March 30th, 1976, to her parents, Karen and Gordon Craig. Even before Bonnie was born, her mother loved her so much and was anxiously awaiting her arrival. Bonnie's mother, Karen, met her father, Gordon, while they were in high school. She got pregnant at 17 with Bonnie's older brother, Jason. She and Gordon got married in July of 1973, and then 3 years later, they had Bonnie. She was her parents' first daughter and the first granddaughter to her grandparents. Everyone was so excited to welcome a baby girl into the family. By the time Bonnie was 3 years old, Karen had split from her father, and unfortunately, he hadn't been a big part of Bonnie's life. Karen had met someone special who cared about her and her kids. His name was Gary Campbell. It wasn't long before Karen and Gary tied the knot, and by the time Bonnie was 5, the couple welcomed a son into the world, whom they named Adam. Thrilled to have a younger brother, Bonnie called him her real-life Cabbage Patch doll. Just 1 year later, Karen and Gary welcomed another baby, Samantha, and Bonnie's life became even more joyful. Bonnie could dress up her baby sister in princess gowns and jewelry, something that Adam certainly wouldn't let her do. As Samantha grew up, she wanted to be just like her big sister Bonnie, who was 6 years older. Bonnie was also such a cutie pie, with big blue eyes and freckles across her nose. Plus, she excelled in everything she set out to do, especially in academics. It wasn't until Samantha was in 3rd grade that she finally figured out Bonnie was her half-sister. She had always thought they had the same parents, and this discovery tore her apart. If anyone tried to point out the fact that Bonnie was Samantha's half-sister and not her full sister, she would reply that she didn't know what they were talking about. As a big sister to Adam and Samantha, Bonnie loved looking after them, and she treated them like they were her own children. She was their stability, as their world changed quite often, more than most kids. Their new blended family moved a lot for Gary's job as he worked for BP Oil Company. Over the years, Bonnie attended 6 elementary schools, 2 junior high schools, and 1 high school. One thing she became good at was accepting change and learning to fit in with new people quickly. First, the family moved from Calgary, Alberta, to San Francisco, where they lived in the East Bay area. Bonnie and her siblings were thrilled because they had a pool and a huge backyard at that point. Following their relocation to California, the family soon traded sunshine and pools for snow and ice skating in Anchorage, Alaska. Now, this may not be paradise to everyone, but Alaska appealed to the kids even more than California with its constant sunshine. There was just so much to do against the beautiful scenic Alaskan backdrop. However, they wouldn't get to enjoy it for long. Soon, Gary's career took them from Alaska to West Texas, back to the lower 48. While Bonnie wasn't as happy in Texas as she had been in Alaska or California, they lived in a neighborhood with plenty of activities for her and her siblings, and they enjoyed it as best they could. Initially, the family lived in Midland, Texas, for 2 years before they moved to Houston, where they stayed in a community called Sugarland for a few months. But it wasn't long before Bonnie's family packed up their things once again to move. When the kids were asked by Karen and Gary where they would want to live if they could choose anywhere in the world, all 3 answered Anchorage, Alaska, without hesitation. So, back to Alaska it was, and everyone was happy to be heading back to the place they considered home. Following their return, Bonnie was in junior high school, but soon another big change came. Karen and Gary decided to get a divorce, which was very hard on all the kids. Bonnie saw Gary as her father, and now Samantha and Adam were alternating weeks between their parents. 1 week with Gary and 1 with Karen, meaning Bonnie saw less of them. Nonetheless, she remained close to her stepdad. After junior high, Bonnie attended Service High School, where she excelled academically. She was active in sports, music, and many other clubs and organizations, both at school and in the community. Besides coaching the swim and diving teams, she enjoyed horseback riding, writing poetry, playing the violin and viola in the school orchestra, and she was even the first girl to join the Service High School wrestling team. Her goal was to never get pinned. But something very traumatic was going to happen. Another change in Bonnie's life, one more permanent than most. Her dear friend Katie Garcia died in a drunk driving accident. This tragedy changed Bonnie's life forever and may have had a significant impact on her future in an unexpected way. After Katie's death, Bonnie made 2 vows. She would never drink a drop of alcohol, and she wouldn't get behind the wheel of a car. She refused to drive, walking everywhere or taking the bus instead. She didn't even bother to get her driver's license, as the fear was much too intense. Bonnie even founded a chapter of Students Against Drunk Driving at her school. She was truly an incredible person with a heart for other people. And there was someone who had her heart too. Her boyfriend, Cameron Miyazaki. He was a year ahead of her, and they met while he was in his senior year. They were smitten, and you could tell they were made for one another. Bonnie even posed with him in his senior pictures, and they were adorable. Soon, however, another change came. Cameron graduated before Bonnie and moved to California to study architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. Though his leaving was inevitable, it was still a loss for Bonnie, though temporary, as they remained in a long-distance relationship. They talked multiple times a day, either by phone or email. After graduating from high school, Bonnie enrolled at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. She wanted to become a psychologist, and things were just beginning to come together for her, even though so much had already come to an end. At this point, Bonnie had decided it was time to move out of her mother's house. Things had gotten a little cramped. Her mother had started dating a man named Jim Foster a couple of years before, and he had 3 kids of his own, ranging in age from 8 to 13. Karen still had her 3 younger children living with her, and her oldest, Jason, was 20 and lived with his girlfriend in his own apartment. Bonnie thought it was time to have her own space and be a little more independent, so she asked if she could live with her stepdad, Gary. That way, she still got to see her younger siblings, Adam and Samantha, whenever they came to their dad's house every other week. Gary's house was only 15 minutes away from her university, so things worked out quite well. The vows Bonnie made after Katie's death required many sacrifices, especially once she started college. Typically, students who attend college go to parties, partake in alcohol, and certainly enjoy getting around in a car, but not Bonnie. She held firm to those promises. She took the public bus to school 3 days a week and walked 2 miles from her stepdad's house in the freezing Alaskan cold just to get to the bus stop for her university. Most of Bonnie's classes were packed into either 2 or 3 days a week because she worked part-time at Sam's Club. This 2-mile pre-dawn walk on a desolate rural road was long and could be a bit scary, especially for someone walking alone. Bonnie was aware that this walk wasn't the safest. She even gave her sister safety tips about walking alone in the dark, one of which was to carry pepper spray. Bonnie always carried a bottle of pepper spray on her long morning walks. But would that be enough if someone confronted her with criminal intent? I want to take you to the morning of September 28th. I want to take you to the morning of September 28th. I want to take you to the morning of September 28th, 1994. 18-year-old Bonnie Craig woke up at 5 a.m. to get ready for her walk to the bus stop as usual. Bonnie always made sure she had enough time to make it to class because she took pride in being punctual. So she set off before sunrise, even though her English class didn't start for another 2 hours at 7 a.m. After leaving her stepdad's house, Bonnie walked 45 minutes to the bus stop where she was supposed to take the bus to the University of Alaska. Or so everyone thought. 9 hours later, another Anchorage University student, Jennifer Broshwing, was snapping photos on a hiking trail in Chugach State Park, which is just south of Anchorage. This park is about 15 miles away from where Bonnie lived, and it's a beautiful park. Just look at it. These are photos from Google Maps, and they don't even do it justice. It's off of Alaska Route 1, and on the other side of the state highway is part of the Gulf of Alaska. Mid-September is actually one of the best times to visit Alaska because the weather is warmer, the days are longer, and the temperatures are cooler but still comfortable, ranging from 60 to 67 degrees. It's a great time to enjoy your surroundings. As this university student was focusing her camera on the scenic view, something caught her eye, something in the water below the 33-foot cliff that didn't look natural. The color stood out first. It was something bright, something blue, which contrasted against the rushing white tips of the water in McHugh Creek. As she zoomed in closer, she had a horrifying revelation. It was a woman. She was lifelessly floating in the shallow part of the water. It was unmistakably a woman. This was before cell phones, and the student didn't know what to do. She immediately ran back to the parking lot, jumped in her car, and drove to a way station, because that was the nearest place she could find to call 911. Because this was a state park, Alaska State Troopers had jurisdiction, and they responded to the location right away. Once on scene, they observed the woman at the bottom of a very high cliff. She was face down and fully clothed. I actually have footage and some still shots of what they were looking at. You can see her at the base of the cliff. One of her arms is outstretched, and she's in a very unusual position, which is an indication of a fall. This isn't an area of the creek that would be easy to get to unless someone had fallen from that portion of the cliff above or walked through the creek to get to this exact spot. So what happened? officers went to the top of the cliff and looked down from that position. It is a hazardous part of the park. Now, there are railings in this exact spot, but back in 1994 there were none. So if you had been hiking there and you slipped, you would fall right to your death. That's what they think happened in this case. But we wouldn't be here today talking about it if that is what actually happened. You can see right here how far down the creek is. The officers believe that this poor woman had been taking in the sights and the sounds of this beautiful park and lost her footing, falling to her death. But who was she, and did anyone hear or see what had happened? Once the medical examiner arrived, they could get closer to the body, and at that point, could tell the injuries that had been sustained and transport her to the medical examiner's office for an official identification. On the scene, officers had already made a preliminary identification through a ring she was wearing, a class ring. They believed that the woman was Bonnie Craig. They needed to contact her family to see if she had made it home that evening. By the time officers were confident that this was Bonnie, it was close to 10 p.m. that night. That's when a knock came on Bonnie's stepdad's door. It was unusual to get a knock that late at night. They were already wondering why Bonnie wasn't home yet. When Adam and Samantha could see it was an officer, they both gathered at the top of the stairs to watch and listen. When Gary shouted, "Oh my God, not Bonnie," and dropped to his knees, they knew that something terrible had happened to their older sister. Samantha prayed that Bonnie would be okay. Maybe she was just in the hospital. She hoped that nothing serious had happened. However, Samantha's uneasy feelings worsened when she saw her dad collapsed in tears right in front of the officers at the front door. The kids had never seen their father cry, and now they had to inform Bonnie's mother of the devastating news. But there was a problem. She was out of town with her boyfriend, Jim. They were all the way in Florida for Jim's brother Ken's wedding. What's worse is that they were on a sailboat, far from a phone. Karen and Jim had left 2 days before, on September 26th, on a red-eye from Anchorage to Tampa, Florida. Then they chartered a 37-foot sailboat in St. Petersburg and made their way up the Gulf Coast to St. Mark's, a very small port town where Jim spent a lot of time growing up. They decided to make a little vacation out of having to fly so far away for a wedding. This was also a chance for Karen to meet Jim's parents for the very first time. They finally got settled in by Wednesday, September 28th, the same day that Bonnie set out towards the bus stop in the early morning darkness. That evening, Karen and Jim met up with Jim's stepmom, Mary, and his father, who's also named Jim, for dinner, as well as Ken and his soon-to-be wife, Valerie. On Karen's side of the world, everything was great. They were laughing, joking, and having a wonderful time. Karen had no idea what terrible fate had befallen her precious Bonnie, and she wouldn't until 3 a.m. That's when there was a knock on the boat's entryway. Who in the world would be knocking on their boat at this hour? Karen asked. She heard, "It's Ken, Jim's brother." When she slid open the door panels, she immediately knew that something wasn't right. If the time wasn't enough to indicate that, Karen saw the expression on Ken's face. It said so much without him having to say anything at all. Karen asked, "What is it?" And he managed to get out the words, "It's Bonnie. She was in a hiking accident." Now, we don't know Karen, but I've gotten to know her very well through my research. Karen is a strong, intelligent, headstrong woman who knows her children. The first thing she thinks is that this is ridiculous. Clearly Ken has his wires crossed. Why drive all this way? It's a long drive to come out to their boat, especially to tell her something like this, because if this was a joke, it wasn't funny. One thing's for sure in Karen's mind, this must be a mistake. Ken says he's sorry, and she's still staring at him confused. She said, "Who told you that?" That's when she sees it, a yellow post-it note. Ken's holding it in his hand. He stretches out his arm, trying to show her what's written on the post-it, but she doesn't care. He says, "I'm sorry again," and Karen's getting more and more frustrated. Then he explains that an Alaska state trooper called him and told him to get a message to Karen. On that post-it was the officer's number. He's stretching out his arm, trying to hand the post-it to her. She snatches it out of his hand and says, "Not my Bonnie. How do they know?" He explains he doesn't know anything. All he knows is that Bonnie had been in an accident and they said to have Karen call. There's no phone on their boat, so Karen and Jim have to get dressed and walk to a nearby payphone. Karen can hardly dial the number, she's shaking so hard. So Jim takes the phone, does it for her, and gives the operator the information they've been given. She says she doesn't recognize it, and pretty much tells them, "You know what? I'm kind of snappy right now. It's 11 p.m. Maybe you should just call back in the morning." Well, Karen, already frustrated with a lot of other emotions running through her, isn't in the mood. She grabs the phone and repeats the trooper's information. She basically lets this operator know, in no uncertain terms, that she had just been told that her daughter died in a hiking accident. That definitely changed the operator's tone. Finally, Sergeant Mike Mars comes on the line and says, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that I have to tell you this, Miss Campbell. Bonnie's body was found in McHugh Creek. She fell off a cliff. She's dead. I'm so sorry." This is every parent's worst nightmare. It's hard enough navigating parenthood. We worry about our kids from the minute they're conceived, and once they're born, it's even harder. I don't know how many nights I stayed awake, making sure my daughter was still breathing. Our children are our everything. They're a piece of us. If we lose them forever, a piece of us dies with them. But Karen isn't the average parent. This is a woman who worked as an undercover reserve officer for the Anchorage Police Department for the last 3 years. She's tough. Karen has worked on drug-related cases, gone through the police academy, and is well respected. She likes a challenge and is a self-proclaimed adrenaline junkie. She even worked as a reporter at one point. This wasn't her first rodeo, but it was the first time something hit so close to home. Of course, Karen cared just as much as any other parent, but there was something different. She had an investigator's mind. First things first, she wanted Bonnie's case to be handed over to the department she works with, the Anchorage Police Department. They kind of look down on state troopers. I'm sure you know how all of that works, the competition. But it's not just that. From the first time Karen heard the news, she didn't believe it. She understood what they were saying, that Bonnie was dead. But there was no way this was an accident. Karen is close with the guys at the homicide department at the Anchorage Police Department. She wants people on the case who think like her. She needs to get to the bottom of this. Instinctually, Karen's asking a bunch of questions as a parent, but also as an investigator. Who was Bonnie with? Sergeant Morris said no one. Bonnie was out there alone. Karen wants to know how Bonnie got there. For example, she knows, like many others, that Bonnie doesn't drive. Karen is actually starting to become convinced it's not Bonnie at all. This has got to be someone else's child. Besides, they hadn't even officially identified Bonnie yet. That would come later. We know this location was at least 10 to 15 miles away from Gary's house. It doesn't make sense to Karen. She keeps asking questions like, what time did they find her? Morris says it was around 2:30. And Karen has one more reason to believe this is all a big mistake. She knows Bonnie. Bonnie wouldn't miss a class. There's no way. She lets Morris know that Karen wants to know what makes them so sure that this is Bonnie. That's when he explains that her name was on a class ring that she was wearing, and they pulled up her state ID and compared the picture to their Jane Doe. No one had actually identified her in person yet. The police were waiting for Karen to do that. There was one other question that Karen had. She didn't want it to come out of her mouth, but it did, and it came out in a different way than I'm going to relay it to you. She asked if there was any evidence of forced intercourse, and the officer explained no. Bonnie was fully dressed. But we know that's not proof. Just because you're still dressed doesn't mean it didn't happen. Karen asked if they had collected any evidence at the scene, and this is when she gets extremely frustrated. The sergeant says something. There is no evidence it was an accident. There's nothing to collect. Wow. He even added that because they identified her, there wasn't anything else to look for. Really? Well, Karen isn't so sure about that. I wouldn't be either. We have to take into account that officers deal with these situations again and again. Karen may not be the typical parent, but typically speaking, almost every parent wants to believe that there's been a mistake. It's not their child that has died, especially in an accident. There just has to be something more. But in Bonnie's case, there was more. Karen gets on the very first flight that she can back to Alaska, hoping it wasn't Bonnie at the morgue. There were so many things going through Karen's mind, but she still can't shake that none of this makes sense to her. Gary feels the same way when they get a chance to talk. Karen gets to the airport and, with time before her flight, hangs out by the payphone, calling her loved ones to let them know what was going on. But Karen makes another call to a friend, Kara, who's a reporter in the Anchorage area. Karen is connected. She's assembling her army. She used to be a reporter, remember? She has friends. This friend doesn't pick up at the time, so she leaves a message. The entire flight, Karen's hoping that this is all just a mix-up, that it's not Bonnie, that there's a reasonable explanation for all of this. Maybe Bonnie let someone borrow her ring, and she'll apologize and explain what happened. I want you to know that I got a lot of this information as accurately as possible from reading Bonnie's mother's book. But just so you know, this is where all this information is coming from about what was going on behind the scenes that a lot of shows and news articles will not tell you. Once Karen lands, she sees a familiar face, the police chaplain, Burke McQueen. Karen and Jim know him very well, and they give him a hug. He offers his condolences for the accident, but Karen tells him, if it's Bonnie, then it's got to be murder. Karen's got work to do, but first, the hardest part. She needs to go down to the funeral home and identify Bonnie. How awful to go from sunny skies in Florida on a boat to the darkness of having to face with your deceased teenager. But there she was, laying on a gurney with a white sheet on top of her, just like in the movies, except this was real life. They pulled the sheet down from her face. Karen looks, and it's undeniable. It's Bonnie. She's frozen in time, just lifeless, but still Bonnie. Now she has her confirmation. But remember what she said. If it's Bonnie, then it's gotta be murder. That thought only intensified when she goes down to talk to the troopers at the police department. Karen explains it doesn't make sense. Bonnie was on her way to class. Where's her backpack, her books, her pepper spray? There were so many questions. Karen is about to get bombarded with more from reporters. The local news outlets have jumped on this story. A young, beautiful college student found dead in a creek. Karen invites the questions and the attention because remember, this used to be her job. She knows many of these reporters personally, but there's another reason she wants her daughter's story out there. She knows this is no accident, and they have to act fast. The news travels way faster than the troopers lift a finger to do more than call Bonnie's death an accident. Her story is getting traction. It's going through the entire city, and it won't stop there. The next day, Karen, Jim, Gary, Jason, Adam, and Samantha make their way to the funeral home to say goodbye to Bonnie. It's hard seeing a person they once knew to be so full of life, just have that life stolen from them. They're a shell of who they once were. But her siblings wanted a chance to see her one last time, and Karen did too. When she lifted Bonnie's arm to hold it close to her, she noticed something that wasn't right. Her knuckles were bruised and swollen. Karen begins to pull the white sheet down to expose more of Bonnie's body, and what she sees makes her scream for them to go get the state troopers back over there quick. The funeral director was literally waiting to prepare Bonnie's body for the next step in the funeral process, and Karen won't let them. She demands that the troopers come back to take photos because these were clearly defensive wounds. It's hard because she's a grieving mother. Bonnie fell from 30 feet onto rocks in a shallow creek. She's bound to have sustained a number of injuries, right? But Karen won't give up. I imagine that this is a mother's last chance, the only chance to gather as much information as she can, because her daughter will truly be gone forever soon. You must preserve evidence of what her body looked like right then and there. This should have been done right away, but remember, there was no investigation, it was an accident. As much as Karen begs, the troopers don't give in. Time is running out, so she tries something else. She calls her supervisor at APD, but he can't help her either. It's out of their jurisdiction, and they're so sorry. I was so frustrated for Karen because time is ticking by. She's standing in a funeral home, being pressured to make decisions on what coffin to put her daughter in. She doesn't want to risk losing any potential evidence, so she tells the funeral director she wants Bonnie to be put in a cement vault. That way, thinking to the future, Karen would be able to have her body taken back out in the event that someone will listen to her and they can collect more evidence. Talking to the media worked, though maybe not the way Karen intended, or so it seemed at first. Sergeant Morris calls her down to the station and gets right to the point. He says, "Don't talk to the media. Stop giving them fuel. Stop calling Bonnie's death a murder." But why? She wants to know what difference it makes. That's when he says something interesting. He says it might hamper their investigation. Wait a minute. Investigation? Wasn't Bonnie's death an accident? What investigation are they talking about? Karen doesn't know anything about that. So maybe going to the media was the right thing to do. It's true, Morris explains that they're just investigating all angles at that point, but still it's a step in the right direction as far as Karen is concerned. Next, Morris says he wants her, Gary, Adam, and Samantha to give them fingerprints, DNA, and hair samples. But why? Well, they explain it's to eliminate them as suspects. But why the kids? That's what Karen wants to know. Why put them through that? And Morris says this, "Listen, we really want Gary's DNA, but it will look suspicious if we're only collecting his." So now Karen's head is just spinning. First, she's expecting to go to a wedding, a vacation, meeting Jim's family for the first time, relaxing on a boat. There's a knock at the door at 3 a.m., news that her daughter is dead. Then she's begging the police to investigate it as a murder, them refusing, and now this, claiming her ex-husband who raised Bonnie is a suspect. There are so many thoughts running through her head. Could it possibly be because he had just had a very weird conversation with Karen about something Bonnie had supposedly said out of the blue not too long ago about where she wanted to be buried? Maybe a reason that he wanted to ship her body so far. Plus, Gary wasn't even supposed to be home the day Bonnie went missing. That's right, he was on a business trip and he cut it short out of nowhere, coming home the night before. It turns out he was upset with Bonnie for being out past her curfew because she was supposed to be watching the younger children. Could he have been mad enough to cause her harm? Before I go deeper down that rabbit hole, I want to go back because things have been going on with the state troopers. Just by looking at Bonnie's body at the scene the day she was found, they were able to tell that she had been dead for several hours, which meant she must have been hiking before sunrise. This added to the mystery and suspicion that there might be more to the story. Now, to the cause of death. The medical examiner determined that Bonnie died as a result of drowning. However, she also sustained a number of severe head injuries from the fall off the cliff. But could it have been something else before her lungs filled up with water? Bonnie suffered at the bottom of that cliff for who knows how long. There were definitely missing pieces of the puzzle. For one, getting to the park before the sun came up meant that Bonnie got there soon after she left Gary's. But how? Someone must have picked her up. Could she have taken a bus and skipped class? But why? Troopers did find something at the scene. It might not have seemed suspicious at first, since Bonnie's death was ruled an accident, but a trooper named Robert Beatty got on his hands and knees and discovered a drop of blood the size of an eraser head. It was around 5 to 6 feet away from the edge of the cliff. Blood where it shouldn't be if this was truly an accident. According to Beatty, the drop looked like it fell straight down. This means something happened to Bonnie before she plummeted off the side of that cliff, something that was forceful enough to make her bleed. If this was indeed her blood, however, they found no signs of violence or weapons at McHugh Creek. The investigators involved knew it was going to be difficult to solve this case. They suspected they were dealing with a homicide, but they didn't let the media or the family know. This was a tactic they were using. They figured it must be someone close to Bonnie, maybe even a family member or a boyfriend, someone who would be in the circle of individuals that would get information related to them. So, they refrained from sharing any of that information with anyone. That's why they were upset with Karen for calling it a murder. They thought the killer would assume there was an investigation and would want to lay low. Now that you know what's going on, let's go back to Bonnie's family. Troopers were finally asking them questions to gain insight into what Bonnie was doing the morning of her death and to look into Gary since he was a person of interest. There was something even more suspicious than wanting to ship her body to Canada. Apparently, Gary refused to let Karen remove Bonnie's belongings from his home. He even went so far as to put a lock on Bonnie's door so that not even his own children could go inside. Why? It all started when Gary asked Karen where his framed picture of Bonnie had gone. Karen explained she had given it to the troopers. They needed a picture of her. Gary accused Karen of stealing it and got very defensive about giving the rest of Bonnie's possessions over to her. He told her that Bonnie was his daughter too, though not biologically. He had raised her and had been a part of her life since she was very little, like 3 years old. They had a very close relationship. Karen was frustrated and called Sergeant Morris for help, but he said he couldn't intervene. She needed to get a court order for something like that. Then he could assist her. So she did, and Gary was definitely not thrilled when they got to the front door with that court order in hand. He had to step aside. Karen went in and took boxes and boxes of Bonnie's things. Later, she went through everything and picked out items she thought might help the troopers with the case, like bank statements and other documents. Samantha and Adam were both interviewed. They were staying at Gary's that week. Samantha said she heard Bonnie wake up early, probably around 5 a.m., but she didn't see her. She wanted to get up and look out but was too comfortable in her bed, which she now regrets because that would have been the very last glimpse she would have had of her sister that she loved so much. Samantha did wonder if Bonnie was in a hurry that morning because it sounded like she was rushing around, but other than that, everything was normal. The confusion surrounding Bonnie's death left her family unsure of what to believe or whom to trust. After Bonnie died, Samantha began struggling. She struggled in school because she relied so much on her older sister. She shared everything with her and was lost without the support of her big sister. When Samantha lost Bonnie, she felt like she lost everything. At one point, Samantha even lost trust in her own father. There was one night when Gary was tucking Samantha into bed, and she couldn't help it. She was just 12 years old. She looked up at him and asked, "Dad, did you kill Bonnie?" Of course, he was shocked and hurt. He showed her no. He would never hurt her sister. I thought it was heartbreaking that this poor little girl had to question her own father. But in that moment, that's all Samantha needed to hear. Both Adam and Samantha independently told the troopers that the day Bonnie was killed, their father Gary was home. He was scraping ice off the car and then headed into work. They were able to verify his whereabouts with co-workers and supervisors, so they were able to rule him out as being involved. They let Karen know, but all she ever got in response was, "Let us do our job," or "We're working on it," even "We're looking into it," but nothing else. Karen had to put everything on hold because it was time for Bonnie's funeral. It almost didn't happen. Turns out burying someone can be pretty expensive. It was so unexpected. Karen was self-employed. She had only been working as a real estate agent for the past 10 months. It was $15,000 for Bonnie's funeral expenses, and Karen just didn't have the money. But they said they wouldn't release Bonnie's body without the funds. So, she scrambled around and was able to put it on multiple credit cards. It was tough, but what choice do you have when faced with this predicament? The service was held at a church that Bonnie attended from time to time called Rabbit Creek Community Church. It was surreal. Everyone who loved and adored Bonnie showed up, including her biological father Gordon and Bonnie's boyfriend, who looked distressed. And just like that, it was over. Time for her loved ones to live out their new normal without her. A week passed after Bonnie's death, and Karen decided to start her own investigation. She began by retracing Bonnie's steps. She started at Gary's house on Vern Drive and arrived at approximately 5 a.m. before the sun came up. She wanted to be as accurate as possible, to know exactly what Bonnie's walk was like that morning and every morning. Karen walked a couple of minutes to a road called Legacy Drive. There were sidewalks and plenty of room to walk. She continued to Lake Otis Parkway, a major roadway that's adequately lit and seems safe enough. It's through a residential neighborhood. I don't know what it looked like in 1994, but there were no sidewalks, at least where it begins from Legacy Drive. There is, however, a bike lane. Karen was on this road for at least a good 15 minutes, and yet she was still nowhere near the bus stop. I estimate on the map that this is where she would have been after around 15 minutes. That's when the surroundings change a bit. No more houses, just forests on both sides. Karen actually gets confronted by an aggressive moose. It's kind of normal for this part of Alaska. The moose comes right out from the bushes on the east side of the roadway. She doesn't know what to do, so she hides behind a lamppost. The moose leaves but reappears again, almost taunting her. By the way, a couple of people stopped to talk to Karen. First was a guy in a truck who wanted to know if she was okay because he saw the moose. Second was a state trooper who was also concerned. Karen explained, "I'm Bonnie Craig's mother, I'm just retracing her steps." This clearly shows a few things. 1. Wildlife could have come after Bonnie on these walks. 2. There is a likelihood that strangers could have stopped to talk to Bonnie on this route a number of times. And 3. State troopers are also patrolling this area. There are negatives and positives and things in between. Karen had taught Bonnie from a young age never to accept a ride from a stranger, no matter what. So she knows better. She knows that unless Bonnie knew and trusted a driver, she would never have gotten inside someone's vehicle. But Karen starts to wonder, could Bonnie have been attacked by a wild animal and someone stopped to help, like the guy did in the truck? And maybe she was desperate, got in their car, and this apparent good Samaritan ended up hurting her? This area is a little more dangerous. It's isolated. Karen keeps walking, and the landscape changes again. It's around the hour mark at 6 a.m., and the area is busy near the bus stop. The likelihood that someone snatched her up in this location would be lower. She can't believe how far Bonnie had to walk to get there. It's just a 15-minute drive from Gary's house to the university, which makes me wonder why he didn't just give her a ride in the mornings. In Karen's book, she explained that Bonnie never told her about this. While Karen never knew how far it was, she thinks Bonnie didn't want her mom to worry. She didn't want to give her a reason not to let her live at Gary's house. Bonnie was telling Karen that this would help her get to the university, that it was close by and convenient. Bonnie was also headstrong like her mama, and probably wouldn't have accepted a ride because she wanted to work for what she earned. Karen was no closer to understanding what happened to Bonnie after she got to the bus stop. However, she did go back to her car and drove around, hoping she could locate Bonnie's backpack or any of her belongings for clues that might lead to a break in the case. But nothing turned up. This woman went everywhere. She went down into ditches on the sides of the roads. It was clear that Karen was willing to do anything for her daughter. She wasn't going to give up. But time doesn't stop for any of us, and before she knew it, it was 1995. A new year, but no new information regarding Bonnie's death. At least no news that the police were willing to share with Karen. Karen started off the new year with a call to Sergeant Mars and asked him one direct question, using the R word that I can't use. She wanted to know if Bonnie was forcibly violated. His response was, "Karen, we can't confirm or deny that." Karen wanted to know why, and basically Mars told her it was just not clear at this point. Karen started off the new year with a call to Sergeant Mars and asked him one direct question, using the R word that I can't use. She wanted to know if Bonnie was forcibly violated. His response was, "Karen, we can't confirm or deny that." Karen wanted to know why, and basically Mars told her it was just not clear at this point. It had been 3 months, so Karen wondered what was taking so long. But these things do take time. The truth is, the troopers did believe that even though Bonnie was fully clothed, her jeans zipped up, panties and bra intact, her shirt covered with a jacket, she could have been violated. The perpetrator could have ordered her to get dressed or could have dressed her himself. They did collect a swab as part of their medical examination, and there was male DNA present inside Bonnie. However, this information is kept under seal in California. Detectives gathered DNA samples from Bonnie's boyfriend Cameron, sent his sample and Gary's to the lab for analysis, and neither one turned out to be a match. Plus, Cameron could not have been in Alaska at the time of Bonnie's murder. Multiple witnesses saw him in California on September 28, 1994. Police investigated Bonnie's activities in the moments leading up to her murder. Bonnie's last sighting was on her way to the bus stop, the same path she took every time she traveled to school. There were at least 2 eyewitnesses, but there was no proof that she ever got on that bus. They believed that Bonnie was snatched up by her killer while she was walking in the darkness. She had a haunting foreshadowing conversation with her younger sister, Samantha, the night before she was killed. Bonnie told Samantha she was working on an assignment that she had to turn in the next day for her English class at 7 a.m. The topic was saying goodbye. Bonnie wrote about how she moved around a lot as a kid and had to leave so many of her friends behind. She also talked about her biological father, who wasn't around when she was a child. Within 24 hours of writing that essay, Bonnie Craig would be dead. Finally, Karen got some positive news in a way. Sergeant Mars called to let her know that they've made some conclusions in Bonnie's case as far as the medical examiner is concerned. Now, they were willing to allow Karen to view Bonnie's autopsy report. It was the second week of January in 1995, about 5 months since Bonnie was found. It was about time. There were a couple of caveats. Karen had to meet with the medical examiner, she could not have copies of the report, and she could not discuss the findings with anyone, not even her own family. She agreed. Karen met with Dr. Norman Thompson, who conducted Bonnie's autopsy, and he handed her the documents. The first thing that stood out to Karen was the manner of death. Homicide. I guess that was their new conclusion. Now, they could finally share this with Karen. She hadn't even received Bonnie's death certificate at this point, so this was the first time she had seen the manner of death officially ruled as homicide. In addition to what we already know, Karen saw that there were multiple blunt force trauma injuries to Bonnie's head, 11 lacerations in total. Plus, her left index finger was broken. The report went on to say that the contributing causes of death, if Bonnie was still alive when she went into that water, would have been drowning and/or hypothermia. She also had tearing down below, indicating forceful or rough intercourse. Karen wanted to know if this proved someone forced themselves on her, and Dr. Thompson said that part was inconclusive. They didn't know if it was consensual but rough or forced. He just could not be certain. But we know that Bonnie was in a committed, though long-distance relationship. But to the defense at trial, that wouldn't matter. They could argue that she was seeing someone else, but who? Well, that leads to the next piece of evidence that Dr. Thompson pointed to as something that could provide proof: the DNA. In case you are confused about where they're getting this DNA, it is from the semen inside her. If they can link it to someone, they could find out if there was a guy Bonnie was seeing and question him about his whereabouts and their relationship, etc. That's the only way to get to the bottom of this. So far, the state troopers have gathered DNA data from every guy who crossed Bonnie's path, and none of the samples have matched. Karen knows in her heart it's the killer's DNA left behind, not some random guy Bonnie was seeing. That just wasn't how Bonnie operated. But they had to prove this now. The medical examiner handed Karen the autopsy photos, and they were hard to look at. Clearly, the wounds on Bonnie's head were not caused by a fall. Dr. Thompson indicated the areas do not coincide with the position of her body. For instance, the back of the bottom of her head, but the weapon that made these wounds is unknown. This is still all a mystery. That was it for now. Karen had some closure, but she was even more determined to find out who killed her daughter. She made flyers and bumper stickers. A friend of hers, Sandy Cassidy, even started a group called Friends and Family of Bonnie Craig. They were trying to field information from the public and to keep Bonnie's name and face out there. The efforts paid off. Bonnie's image appeared on the sides of buses. There were bumper stickers with the words "Who killed Bonnie?" and more. Leads kept coming in. About a week later, there was a break in the case when detectives spoke to Bonnie's co-workers at Sam's Club. They talked about a man who worked with Bonnie and seemed to like her a little too much. Bonnie had even gone to her supervisor with concerns about this guy. He went so far as to use the company computer to look up Bonnie's employee record and get her phone number. He called her repeatedly despite her request for him to stop. Detectives brought the co-worker in for an interview, and obtained a DNA sample, but it would take time to process. Meanwhile, another co-worker was reported acting suspiciously. He failed to attend a meeting at work that was held around the same time they believed Bonnie was killed. This individual also provided a DNA sample, and now they had to wait. Meanwhile, Jim and Karen invited Jim's brother Ken and his wife Valerie to visit. It had been 8 months since that 3 a.m. knock on their charter boat. When Ken informed them of the bad news regarding Bonnie, Jim asked Karen if she thought she would be up to taking a boat trip, but it would be close by, from Seaward to Whittier. It's something they used to do all the time, and it would be great to be able to take their guests out and do something. Plus, they could be back within an hour or two if they needed to for any reason. Karen was hesitant. It brought back a lot of memories, but all they had done was cry, investigate, wait, and grieve for almost a year. So, she decided it was a good time to at least try to change the pace. They grabbed the couple from the airport and off they went to the marina, where their 37-foot Creolock named Sea Monkey was stored. I lived on a very similar style S2 sailboat growing up, and seeing this boat brought back so many memories. They planned to sail for about a week. It should be nice to just get away, grill some food, drink some wine, and enjoy the sights and sounds of the sea. But you'll never believe what's about to happen. On their last day, they're pulling into Whittier Marina. They radio in, letting the harbor know that they're preparing to dock. They're informed that the Coast Guard has been trying to reach them, that there's been an emergency. It's déjà vu. Karen is in disbelief. There are so many thoughts going through her mind. Is it going to be another one of her children? But this time, the message isn't for her, it's for Jim. The Coast Guard informs him and Ken that their dad had died of a heart attack. Neither one of them could believe it because they had just wished him a 63rd birthday a few days ago, and he was fine. Maybe boating is bad luck for them, but this is sad. The last 2 times they were on a boat, they received news that a loved one had passed. Now, they're rushing back, doing the same routine they did before, preparing for another funeral. They say bad things happen in threes. Tell me why. Once Karen is back from yet another burial, something crosses her mind. Could she have something to do with Bonnie's murder? Let me explain. As I mentioned, Karen had worked for the past 3 years as a reserve officer with the Anchorage Police Department. I had never heard of this before, but you can think of it as being a part-time employee who's on call, a backup for when they need more staff. Reserve officers are subject to the same standards of performance and department policies as sworn officers. Karen was used to working undercover operations, posing as someone buying drugs to bust drug dealers. This is a dangerous job. Karen had to wear a hood and a mask to conceal her identity. She would silently nod at the person who sold her the drugs so they could make a bust later. According to Karen, she had purchased crack for the Anchorage Police Department 5 or 6 times. She began to realize that her undercover work might have jeopardized the life of someone she loved so much, her daughter. Someone came forward, someone close to her, with information regarding Bonnie's death. They were convinced that after Karen was involved in a sting that resulted in the arrest of several members of a local drug lord's organization, that drug lord had targeted Karen's family. This informant told Karen that Bonnie was probably killed as a message to the Anchorage Police Department to back off. Wow, this could definitely be a major lead. So, of course, Karen wanted to let Sergeant Mars know right away. According to her, Bonnie was murdered the day after people she identified as drug dealers were released from prison, making the story seem even more credible. Despite the lengths investigators go to conceal someone like Karen's identity during a drug bust, once you're arrested, they can figure out who you were that busted them. Karen's name appeared all over the legal documents because, by law, an offender has the right to face their accusers. Karen rushed to contact Sergeant Mars, and he had news for her too. The DNA tests for both Bonnie's co-workers came back as negative, a match. That was even more reason for her to give him all the information that the informant had shared. However, Karen was not satisfied with the response she got. After she provided him with all the details, he just kept asking her where she got this information. He seemed more interested in that than in Bonnie's murder. She told him she was not going to give up her source. She promised she wouldn't sell, because she thought it was someone within the department. Afterward, Karen said this detective had almost accused her of obstructing her daughter's investigation because she refused to give that name. In turn, Karen said he refused to investigate further. She truly believed her undercover work could be the reason for her daughter's death. They could have killed her by mistake, maybe trying to target Karen, who used to live at that address and looked similar. Karen started feeling responsible for Bonnie's murder, but apparently the detectives did look into it and nothing ever panned out. The most important thing was to figure out whose DNA was found inside Bonnie's body. That would lead them to the killer, right? Or close enough. But the CODIS database was a new invention, its pilot program launching just 4 years before Bonnie was killed. It would not be fully operational until 1998, so unless they had a name, brought that person in, and got a sample of their DNA to analyze, they wouldn't find a match. Karen's surviving children went through a lot. Not only did they lose their sister, but it was almost as though they lost their mother as well. They did not get much attention. Sadly, Karen's life was consumed with trying to find Bonnie's killer. It was hard for her to focus on anything else. Even if there were brief moments where she had a chance to clear her mind and pay attention to her children, she was always pulled away by something. By June 1995, she had a new cell phone, which meant even more access to news about Bonnie. Sergeant Mars called her to let her know they had another lead. An instructor from the University of Alaska, actually the English teacher from that 7 a.m. class Bonnie was on her way to when she died, contacted the police. This instructor told detectives that one of Bonnie's classmates might be responsible for her death. Wow, that's pretty shocking to make such a claim. But the instructor told them that the student had written some very strange things about September 28th, the day Bonnie died. Karen wanted to know everything, what was written, where, what was going on, but Mars didn't have much else to share. She had to wait to hear more. But not for long, because just a few days later, she gets a call from an unknown number. It's Bonnie's English teacher. Karen agrees to meet with her. The instructor provides Karen with the suspicious student's journal. After reading several incredibly violent writings filled with anger and just terrible things, Karen's convinced this is the person who killed her daughter. Twice in the journal, the writer referred to September 28th as a difficult day. He wrote that it was going to be a tough day and would put him to the test. Karen also learns that he didn't show up for that 7 a.m. English class that Bonnie was supposed to attend that day. However, the student did attend later on in the day, and he saw the English instructor. He turned that assignment in late, and the instructor noticed something. His clothes smelled like they had just been washed, and he had poured cologne all over himself. She asked him why he was turning it in late, and he said he missed class because he overslept. After learning all this, Karen was even more convinced that this was the guy. He was wearing cologne to cover up the smell of Bonnie's pepper spray. It does sound convincing. Karen also noticed that the writing had become more peaceful after September 28th, but all of this was really super suspicious. This is probably one of the biggest leads yet. Maybe he was driving to class. Bonnie knew him, so she wouldn't have been scared of him. He could have asked her if she needed a ride. They were going to the same exact class. And then, he never shows up. Karen calls her kids because she wants to give them the news. She does this every time something new comes up in the case. Then she brings this journal to a forensic psychologist, who agrees that the detective should look into it. Karen tries to give the journal to Mars, but he says, "Listen, we only go off DNA, and we're already waiting for those results. If we get a match, then we'll look into the journal." I guess it makes sense because it saves time and resources, but I'm sure it was frustrating for Karen. She begins to argue with Mars. This is a common thing for her. She said, well, if the DNA didn't come from the killer, maybe it came from someone else. Maybe he had an accomplice. She is met with the same response. They just have to wait. I understand where she's coming from. There have been many cases in the past where there are two people, and one person is forcing intercourse while the other person is committing another crime. I see where she was going with that line of thinking. She's unsatisfied with the detective's work, so she starts to look into Bonnie's suspicious English classmate herself. She found some very disturbing information. Her investigation revealed that he had been charged with battery and bailed out by a friend involved in another murder. This revelation made Karen think that maybe the friend who bailed out the student killed Bonnie. But weeks later, Mars lets her know the DNA was not a match, and she's angry. She didn't think the DNA mattered, she still thought this guy was involved. The investigation was back at square one. The detectives believed that Bonnie's routine would lead them to her killer. Around 5:20 a.m. on that day, a girl delivering papers in the area, Mendesa Bird, reported seeing Bonnie walking down the street in a jean jacket and a red shirt, which was accurate. Another witness came forward, a man who said he saw an unknown vehicle idling in front of Bonnie's house that September morning. The tip line received an anonymous tip reporting that they saw Bonnie talking to two men in a car at the bus stop on the morning she was killed. However, digging deeper into Bonnie's routine did not reveal anything new about her murder. They went over it time and time again, and 3 years went by. It's the spring of 1998. Karen hasn't stopped checking in with Sergeant Mars. She's putting up posters, doing interviews, raising money for Bonnie's reward fund, and investigating the case on her own time. By this time, Karen had actually decided to go back to work part-time as a reserve police officer for the Anchorage PD. Finally, there's a real break in the case, the first in a few years, and it seems the most promising because it has to do with DNA. Remember, that's all that Sergeant Mars said he cared about. So he calls Karen and says, "Listen, there's some news I want to share with you." He tells her, "We're not sure about everything just yet, but we have a potential DNA match." The thing is, they've had several false leads prior to this, so Karen doesn't want to get her hopes up. But this sounds like it could be connected. He was the bus driver on Bonnie's route. Interesting. This man worked as a bus driver for the city of Anchorage, and he's also been accused of other suspicious acts, like attempting to pick up a 14-year-old girl, the daughter of another bus driver. Several young women came forward to accuse him of harassing them while they were on his bus. Mars also lets Karen know that this man worked as a substitute teacher in Pennsylvania, but was terminated because he made inappropriate remarks to female teenage students. Karen wants to know, do you have this man in custody? But Mars explains they don't. They're still doing their preliminary investigation into his background. He's just keeping Karen apprised of the situation. The bus driver no longer lives in Alaska, so that's another issue. He's in Davis, California. And get this, he moved there just shortly after Bonnie was killed. Mars said he flew out there to interview him, hoping that he would willingly provide his DNA for comparison. When detectives track this guy down, he denies playing a role in Bonnie's murder. He says, "Someone's framing me." He also claims to have an alibi for the day Bonnie died. His stepmother said that he slept most of the day. Despite being cautious, he agrees to give a sample of his DNA without hesitation. He wanted to be cleared. He said, "This is not me." However, after the DNA test came back, detectives got the answers they were looking for. It was a potential match. The situation, however, wasn't straightforward because we have different ways of examining DNA nowadays. The DNA testing indicated a potential match, and even though DNA testing is the standard in forensic science, it was still in its infancy. This was the mid-1990s. It had a long way to go. An attorney for the bus driver demanded that they retest this man's DNA using much more advanced technology. Again, Karen and her family had to wait. But it wasn't long before Karen sees a message on her answering machine. It was Mars telling her to call right away. She wants to know, is it a match? She was really hoping that this would be over, that they had found the guy, but Mars explains they actually need to retest the DNA. So that was the call she was getting. He can't be cleared until they retest it. On both sides, they want to know, is it a match or is it not a match? I had so many questions because I was thinking, why would the test come back as a potential match? What does that even mean? Why would it even come back if he ultimately wasn't a match? It made me realize how grateful I am for the advances in technology, because getting a family's hopes up like this, putting so much time and effort into a person of interest based on obsolete science, seems like a waste of time. Not to mention accusing a person who ends up being innocent. It just seems like Bonnie's case is never going to be solved. But as I said, thankfully technology was advancing. They retested his DNA, and he is not a match. More years pass, and many things have happened, things that you don't usually hear in these cases, because you don't know what's going on in other people's lives that are connected to these victims. Bonnie's older brother Jason and his wife Tracy welcomed a baby into the world. His name was Austin. Karen becomes a grandma for the first time, which is very exciting. But there were also bad things as well. Karen was in a pretty bad car accident. It was a rollover accident with her friend Marcy, and it could have been fatal. It happened the day of her daughter Samantha's surprise birthday party. She was turning 15. Her friends were throwing her a surprise party, and she got 2 surprises that day. One definitely wasn't well received. When her friends yelled, "Surprise!" and jumped out, Samantha yelled out, "My mom was just in an accident." She broke down crying, and Karen felt so bad for ruining that special day. I just kept thinking about this poor family, because then Karen's youngest son, Adam, needed cornea transplants. His eyesight was failing. He was put on a donor list and finally had surgery on his left eye when he was 18. But then, when they went to do it on the right eye a year later, it was not successful, and he was left blind in that eye. There was another thing that no one saw coming. His girlfriend from high school was pregnant, but she didn't tell anyone. Not even Adam. She planned on giving the baby up for adoption, but when she gave birth to baby Jaylee, the state would not let her proceed with the adoption without the father's consent. It was quite a surprise because Gary got a phone call informing him that his son's girlfriend, Jennifer, just had a baby. So Adam flew out to Texas to meet his newborn daughter, and it was love at first sight. And then, surprise, 2 more bundles of joy. In 2001, Jason's wife Tracy had twins, Tanner and Logan. Plus, Jim proposed to Karen after they dated for 8 years, and she said yes. They ended up getting married. Sadly, there was also the Twin Towers attack on the US on September 11, 2001. So many back and forth, good and bad things. 3 years after Jim and Karen tied the knot, they were already divorced. But Karen kept his last name and was no longer going by Karen Campbell. She was going by Karen Foster. They were still seeing each other. It was almost like they were better in a looser relationship, not so committed. In 2002, Karen finally got an opportunity to have her theory about what she thought happened to Bonnie heard on national TV. Unsolved Mysteries reached out, and they did an entire episode where Karen explained that just because the DNA of the student in Bonnie's class didn't match, it didn't mean he wasn't responsible for killing her. It was obvious to Karen that there was a second person involved. From what she knew, she really believed the student had participated in Bonnie's killing. Although Karen did search for this possible accomplice, she was unable to locate one. She told Unsolved Mysteries that she doesn't think she could ever rule this student out as a suspect in Bonnie's death. Then, another tragedy in 2005. Karen's father called with the news that her older brother, Andrew, was dead. He had struggled with mental health issues for a long time and had attempted to end his life before, but he was able to get to the hospital fast enough to have his stomach pumped. This time, his wife, Anna, had filed for divorce, and it was too much for him to take. He left behind a daughter, Alana, and a son, Aaron. This wasn't the first time one of Karen's brothers died. 1 year after Bonnie was born, at the end of October in 1977, Karen's brother Kaj was involved in a horrific car accident that left him in a coma. Karen spent every day with him until he took his last breath. How unbelievably tragic. I just keep thinking, poor Karen. Death has been around her for most of her life, and I feel like she's cheated it a number of times, even once with her grandson in the woods. What was a nice afternoon turned into bears surrounding them, and she just knew right away to quickly and quietly get out of there. She never told her son Jason what happened. But it doesn't end there. The next year, in 2006, Karen is informed that her mother is not doing well. They call it failure to thrive. My grandmother just passed away due to the same thing. It's like they give up, feeling there's nothing to live for, and it's heartbreaking. Everyone around them feels guilty, but there's usually nothing you can do. In Karen's mother's case, they believe it was because she lost her son, not only one but two, and a granddaughter. Once she passes, they conduct an autopsy, which reveals she actually had cancer that had spread throughout her entire body. Like I said, I feel so bad for Karen. But at least, she did have something to celebrate. Samantha, who is now 24, was getting married to her high school sweetheart, Ryan. That's a lot of time to go by, it just flew by. For the new year, Karen decides she's going to take a trip across the country with her friend Melinda. It's January 5th, 2007. It's been 12 years since Bonnie was killed. Karen opens up her laptop in the hotel on a little island in the Philippines and scans her emails. That's when she sees it. An email from a sender she isn't familiar with, and the subject line simply reads, Bonnie. She said that her heart skipped a beat. By this time, a new team had taken over Bonnie's case. It was now considered a cold case. First, the new investigators went over Bonnie's file to ensure the original detectives hadn't missed anything. Eventually, an investigator named Tim Hunter introduced himself as the investigator with the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit. He tells Karen he's aware that she's out of the country right now, but has something very important to share. He asks her to get in touch with him as soon as she can because there's been a development in Bonnie's case. Of course, Karen runs to the front desk of the hotel and calls the trooper immediately, but he doesn't answer. So she leaves a message explaining where she is and that she's going back to her room. Finally, she sees another email from him. It says they have information about a man who is in prison in New Hampshire. They're currently in the process of doing a background check on him, but he wants to tell her about what they've found so far. This sounds familiar, right? Remember the bus driver that didn't amount to anything? So, should Karen get her hopes up? Well, she runs back to the front desk and tries calling him again. He doesn't answer. Hours go by, then a couple of days. Finally, another email arrives. It says, Karen, I want you to know that there have been new developments regarding CODIS. He goes on to explain what CODIS is and lets her know that it is a national database for DNA profiles. It was developed by the FBI, and states are now entering the DNA of incarcerated individuals into the system. During a search of CODIS, a match was made between the DNA from Bonnie's case and someone in the New Hampshire legal system. They did a preliminary background check, and it turns out this man was in Alaska at the time that Bonnie was killed. Now they're going to talk to people who were close to him to gather more information. The trooper apologizes for giving this information over the internet and notes that the phone connection isn't working. He asks her to come in to talk to him in person as soon as she gets back in town. Karen has so many questions. This is big. She writes him back and wants to know everything. Who is this guy? How old is he? Was he working at Sam's Club? Did he know Bonnie? Did he have classes with her? Was he a friend of that kid in class who wrote the journal entries? But when Karen gets the answers, it isn't anything she could have imagined. It's no one they had suspected. The most important question Karen has is whether this DNA match is 100%. That would be good to know. Karen also wants to know more about this trooper because the detective in her is thinking, who is this guy? How much could he possibly know about her daughter's murder? Where was he the last 12 years? Was he even a trooper back then? Let me tell you all the information Karen wanted because it came in the next email from Hunter. First things first, the guy's name is Kenneth Dion. He was born in 1969, which means he's 7 years older than Bonnie. He would have been 25 at the time of her murder. He was incarcerated for robbery and was serving between 6 and 15 years. Although this man was arrested in 2003, his DNA was not entered into the database until late 2006. That's why his name had never come up before in connection to Bonnie's murder. Hunter was familiar with this case. He actually met with Karen early on. Back then, he was with the Criminal Investigations Bureau in Anchorage, but he transferred to the Alaska State Troopers in 1994. This man came out of retirement to work on Bonnie's case and was just assigned to it in March of 2006. By November, he got that match, and now they were in the process of attempting to extradite this man to Alaska from New Hampshire. However, Trooper Tim Hunter had already interviewed Kenneth. He tracked him down and initially played it cool, being casual and calm. He was asking Kenneth about his life, education, and his time in Alaska. He didn't want to tip him off or accuse him of anything related to Bonnie's murder right away. Once he was able to establish a rapport with the suspect, then the real interrogation would begin. Kenneth told him he was a 5th-degree black belt in martial arts and ranked 10th in a world fighting competition. Sure, he did. He talked about his relationships. Kenneth was married back in September of 1994 when Bonnie was murdered. Although Kenneth and his wife were now divorced, he said that he messed up big time and that she was the best thing that ever happened to him. Hunter found it strange how Kenneth never even asked why the Alaskan law enforcement officers had flown across the country to New Hampshire to ask him a few questions. Throughout the interview, Kenneth was civil and answered the questions as though he was an old friend of Hunter's. According to Kenneth, things spiraled out of control for him once he started doing drugs. His drug addiction led him to commit armed robberies to support his habit. Even though he cleaned up and enlisted in the military for a short time, he was kicked out because he kept doing drugs. He was constantly in and out of prison. In 1996, he moved to New Hampshire, where he continued to get into more trouble. During the interview, Hunter asked Kenneth if he had followed any of the local news while he was living in Alaska. Kenneth said, "Oh yeah, I always did." That's when Hunter asked if he knew about a girl named Bonnie Craig. The name did not ring a bell for Kenneth, or so he said. Earlier in the conversation, Kenneth had told the investigator he was better at remembering faces, so Hunter showed him a photo of Bonnie. Again, Kenneth said he had never met her and didn't know who she was. When Hunter examined Kenneth's body language, he noticed a change. It shifted from relaxed and casual to seemingly agitated, kind of rigid and scared. Backing up a little, Hunter wanted to lighten the mood, so he asked, "Well, maybe you guys had a chance encounter?" He laughed and added, "With an 18-year-old? No, my wife would have killed me." Kenneth actually laughed obnoxiously. That's when Hunter had had enough. He finally got right to the point and said, "One thing about it is, later they found her body dead in the Q Creek." When Kenneth realized what this investigator was implying, his smirk vanished. He said, "Whoa, whoa, 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 what are you trying to say?" Hunter informed Kenneth that his name had come up during Bonnie's murder investigation, and Kenneth acted surprised. He said, "I don't understand why my name was brought up." Hunter replied, "Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out." He asked Kenneth if he traveled around the state a lot. Kenneth said he had been to Denali a few times with his friends from the military and maybe Valdez. He also told Hunter that he and his wife used to party a lot, go out dancing, and that because of his cocaine addiction, he often got into fights at bars. He grew up fighting. That was his whole life. Remember, he was a top fighter when he was 17. Hunter asked, "What kind of weapons did you use?" Kenneth replied, "Martial arts weapons, things like an Akai, a prong-like weapon that sort of looks like a fork. I also used nunchucks and a 3-sectional staff." Soon, Kenneth began to catch on to what Hunter was trying to do and invoked his right to an attorney. At this point in the investigation, Hunter contacted Karen. They were now trying to locate people close to Kenneth. Finally, an ex-girlfriend was willing to speak with them. According to Kenneth's ex, he once told her that he could kill someone and get away with it. He said he couldn't go back to Alaska because he had done something there, killed someone. Fast forward to the middle of April 2007. An indictment is set, but no extradition yet. However, a pretrial hearing is going to move forward. Even if this man wasn't in the state, it couldn't come fast enough. Bonnie's closest family members attended the courthouse. It was completely packed. The charges against Kenneth were first-degree murder, second-degree murder with intent to cause serious injury, second-degree murder with extreme indifference to human life, and first-degree sexual assault. They couldn't add a charge of kidnapping because the statute of limitations had already run out, only 10 years. This hearing was not very exciting. It lasted just a few minutes at most. The judge handled it over the phone, with Kenneth's legal representation at the time. He asked if Kenneth could afford a lawyer. Kenneth said no, so they told him one would be appointed to him. They set up a pretrial conference for Halloween, October 31st, 2007, and a trial date for December 17th. Karen and her family were like, "Wait, what? That's all we got?" They were left wanting a lot more, and they got it. Soon after Kenneth's information became public, the media went crazy with it. Additional facts came to the surface, like the fact that Kenneth was in jail just 2 months before Bonnie's murder. However, he was out on parole when she died, and back in jail only 2 months after she was killed for violating his parole. And while he was out, like many criminals do, he allegedly committed a heinous crime. Kenneth was no stranger to crime. He had 18 convictions, 10 misdemeanors and 8 felonies. This man had never gone a full 12 months without committing a crime, except for a 3-year stint from 1999 to 2002. This is a bad dude. After all this information, Karen became a lobbyist for change. Had Kenneth's DNA been put in the database sooner, Bonnie's murder wouldn't have taken this long to solve. At the time, there were only 6 states that collected DNA upon felony arrests. So Karen presented legal arguments to Sarah Palin to change the law. In 12 days, they were able to get a bill passed and signed into law in June of 2007. As it should be, now there are 28 states that have joined the list of collecting DNA samples from suspects who have been arrested on a felony offense. After Kenneth Dion was extradited, he filed several pretrial motions, as many of them do, which stalled this case for years. Karen said that this was an unbelievably hard time for her and her family. Every time they had to go to a hearing or to the courthouse, it was like Bonnie was killed all over again. As soon as a wound would appear to scab over, Kenneth would rip it open again. But finally, he did face a jury in an Alaskan courtroom in May of 2011. Think about all the time that has gone by. This courthouse was packed every day. There was standing room only. The assistant district attorneys were Paul Miovis and Jenna Grunstein, and they knew that Bonnie's murder was most likely going to be a very challenging case to win. The DNA from Kenneth did not 100% prove that he forced Bonnie to have intercourse with him or that he killed her. Their DNA evidence only proved that Kenneth had sexual contact with Bonnie before she died. Aside from this DNA evidence, the state didn't have much else to offer. They had no murder weapon, no motive, and no witnesses. When Kenneth entered the courtroom and had his handcuffs removed, onlookers got a clear view of his knuckles. Across one hand was a tattoo that spelled lost, and on the other hand was the word stole. A lost soul. That's exactly what he was. A lost soul who found an innocent young girl and did horrible things to her. The trial began with the prosecutor's opening statement. The first thing that came up was a beautiful picture of Bonnie's face. She's smiling, and Miovis says, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bonnie Craig." He went on to paint a picture of who Bonnie was, everything we already know about her, and probably much more. This included details like how she would make her siblings breakfast and pack their lunches before heading out for her day, how she would leave notes for them and buy them pizza, and how she worked 30 hours a week, studied in study groups, and would rush to the computer lab to email her boyfriend before and after class. He also mentioned how she had a psychology test that she failed to show up for on the day of her murder, but she had studied for it diligently the night before. Something else mentioned was a drop of blood on a leaf above the cliff. Karen never knew about it during the investigation. She found this out 16 years after the murder when the prosecutors took over the case. Before she knew about this blood evidence, the DNA pointed her towards understanding that something happened that was against Bonnie's will. But the blood indicated it was more than a man forcing himself on her. Kenneth's defense lawyers, Andrew Lambert and Leanne Bauer, were aggressive. Their opening statements were on the second day of trial, and according to the defense attorneys, everyone had been hearing for the past 17 years that Bonnie had been murdered, but it wasn't true. This was very hard for Bonnie's family to listen to. The defense attorney insisted that Bonnie fell. She just tumbled down this jagged, rocky cliff, striking her head and causing a skull fracture that led to her death. That's how she died, not murder. I think I would have caused an outburst in the courtroom. I don't think I could have held my tongue. But this defense attorney explained that just because Kenneth's DNA was inside Bonnie and on her panties, on the outside of her pants, doesn't mean she was murdered. Yes, it's true she had intercourse with Kenneth, but it was consensual. Oh my gosh. Don't they all say that? He mentioned the girl on the paper route. Remember her? She identified Bonnie as someone she saw at 5:20 in the morning. But he talks about what wasn't seen. Kenneth, a redhead, someone who would stand out in a crowd. Surely someone would have seen him, right? And no one saw his car, a black Ford Tempo. Other people said they saw someone matching Bonnie's description, talking to two guys with black hair, not red. And they weren't in a black Tempo either. Then the defense attorney mentioned a retired surgeon who jogged that area regularly. He saw a girl matching Bonnie's description, alive and well at 10 o'clock in the morning, jogging with two guys and another girl. He even recounted what Bonnie was wearing. He said she was wearing a blue denim jacket, a white scarf, or something around her neck, and he couldn't remember the color of her shirt, but he did say she had on white jeans or khakis and white tennis shoes. Indeed, this man got a lot of what he saw correct. Bonnie was wearing a blue denim jacket, white jeans, white Nike tennis shoes, and a matching white scarf. The red shirt was the only thing he didn't remember. Karen had actually met with this man a long time ago, and at the time she thought this was really vital information for solving Bonnie's case. But sitting in the courtroom, listening to this as the defense attorney goes on, she changed her mind. She thinks it may hurt Bonnie's case. Karen had actually met with this man a long time ago, and at the time, she thought this was really vital information for solving Bonnie's case. Not to mention the reason the surgeon recognized Bonnie was because he was familiar with anatomy, and there was a physical attribute on her eyes, epicanthic skin on her upper eyelids, almost the deep-set part of more almond-shaped eyes. This is very distinctive to him. Karen has it too, and he recalls seeing those eyes on that day and again in the newspaper after her death. That's why he came forward. The defense attorney went on to say that the investigation at McHugh Creek on September 28, 1994 was inadequate. For instance, he pointed out the fact that the state troopers had lost the crime scene video that they filmed the day Bonnie was found. Yes, that's right, they lost the video. When Karen heard this, that this video had been missing for years, it confirmed what she had suspected all along. No one cared about her daughter. Later she said she was sickened to hear how careless they were. The opening argument ended with the defense attorney mentioning the lack of blood. One drop, he said. Shouldn't there be more for someone the prosecution is implying had been beaten with something like a tire iron? No weapon, one drop of blood, and only evidence of intercourse, which you can't even prove happened that day. All of this, in the defense's argument, means it was an accidental death. It was an intense day in court, but it only got more intense. The first witness to be called to the stand for the prosecution was Bonnie's little sister, Samantha, who had grown up and become a 911 dispatcher for the Alaska Police Department. Her job on the stand was to showcase all of Bonnie's amazing qualities. But on cross-examination, you know what the defense did? He went into her personal life, asked her about her divorce and her mom's divorce back then, and how there was such a complicated living arrangement, and the fact that Karen was actually on her second divorce and with her boyfriend on a boat, leaving her kids behind with her 18-year-old daughter who ends up dead. They were definitely trying to paint this family in a bad light. The trial was not off to the best start, and the next day, the prosecution calls Bonnie's boyfriend at the time. He's 34 years old and married, but his love for Bonnie was evident in his testimony. They met when they were little and reunited in high school. As he testified, he was grief-stricken. He said he had never suspected Bonnie of cheating. The prosecutor explains to the jury that Bonnie was too busy to meet a random man secretly. She worked at Sam's Club and was a student at the university, so why would she take time out of her busy schedule to have an affair with a married father with a newborn and a drug problem? They lived in two different worlds and would have never crossed paths. Bonnie would not have had random intercourse with Kenneth Dion. On cross-examination, The defense attorneys point out that Cameron didn't know about times when Bonnie exchanged numbers with other men, or a time she played pool with boys until after midnight. Yes, like normal stuff that teenagers do, but they painted it as though there was something going on behind Cameron's back. Then, there was a letter from Cameron that he had written. He hoped he didn't want to force Bonnie into a long-distance relationship and ruin her college life. It was really making it look like they weren't that committed after all. The prosecution turns things around by asking Cameron about a ring that Bonnie had given him. He wore it for years after her death, and when questioned about it, he broke down in tears. He said that he loved her forever. While the defense attorney needed to remind the jury how so many people have secret lives that no one knows about. After Bonnie's best friend, Lynn Witt, testified about how much Bonnie loved Cameron and how committed they were to one another, the defense still rooted into her over this late-night pool game that they played with these three men in the Army, especially since one of the two besties ended up dating one of these men, Lynn. She went on to get into a relationship, so what about her BFF, Bonnie? Lynn insisted Bonnie wasn't interested in any of these men, but the defense attorney ended with the fact that Lynn wasn't with Bonnie on the day she died, so she can't say who Bonnie was with, can she? She was like, no. He's like, you can't tell me whether Kenneth did anything to her, can you? She's like, no, I can't. The idea that Bonnie was involved with Kenneth doesn't make sense. Even Kenneth himself scoffed. Remember that he laughed when Hanyard merely joked about there being a chance of an encounter with Bonnie? Remember he was doing that interview? Kenneth laughed and said, no, my wife would have killed me. Karen was furious that this defense attorney was trying to smear Bonnie's good name, accusing her of sleeping with this random man, a criminal at that. Bonnie had a stellar reputation. The chances that her daughter hooked up with this married man, in her opinion, were zero. Therefore, the prosecutors let Bonnie's character speak for itself. She was mature, she studied, she was serious and faithful. Plus, why would some 25-year-old married man, who none of her friends or family had ever heard of, suddenly show up on a school day? Suddenly, out of nowhere, the prosecutor runs over to Karen and says, there's something major that just happened. And I'm thinking, oh my God, not again. But it's a good thing. They think someone at the state trooper's office just found the video of the crime scene, the one that had been missing for all those years. Yeah, somehow somebody from the department was reading the newspaper and said, oh yeah, I think I've seen that tape. Wow, so at this point, to process the discovery of this new item, the court decided to take a 5-day recess. Although this crime scene video being found should be good news for the state, since the defense had just received this newly discovered piece of evidence, after the trial already started, it could lead to a mistrial. It could prove how the troopers mishandled the case. However, Kenneth's defense attorney said the video did not warrant a mistrial, so the case moved forward. Karen imagined it was probably because this guy was pretty cocky and thought that he could win the case and that the video would actually help. But would it? It was very difficult for the assistant district attorney to play the tape in front of Bonnie's grieving family in the courtroom. Trooper Robert Beatty, the one who found the bloodstain on the leaf, testified as the video was shown to the jury. When Karen watched the video, she broke down in tears. Bonnie's family had never seen her in that horrible position, floating dead in the creek bed. Even though Karen couldn't stop crying, she made herself watch that entire video. As Karen watched, something amazing and transformative happened. It made her feel better. Seeing this video, Karen knew the truth now. Throughout the last 17 years of the investigation into her daughter's murder, the detectives and the troopers did take her death seriously. Karen realized that she had been wrong when she saw these investigators on their hands and knees, looking for evidence, hunting down the creek bed for the murder weapon. It changed everything for her. The next time she saw Trooper Hanyard, she hugged him and thanked everyone. In that brief moment in the courtroom, 17 years of anger and resentment and tension just went away. But still, the prosecution had a problem with their case, even with this video, and you'll see why. On the stand, Experts testified that Bonnie's pants were smeared with grass and her buttons were undone. A forensic scientist testified and noted that Bonnie had been forced into intercourse and physically harmed before being pushed to her death. He stated that the blood drop on the leaf that the trooper found was an obvious sign that something happened before the fall. The medical examiner who had met with Karen to go over the autopsy report, Dr. Norman Thompson, took the stand and testified that Bonnie's murder wounds could not have resulted from a fall. There were 11 injuries, blunt force trauma to Bonnie's skull. There were no signs of facial injuries, even though she had fallen and landed face down. All the while, the defense attorney, Lambert, was taking a bunch of notes. He was just chomping at the bit. He wanted to say something and couldn't wait to cross-examine this doctor. The doctor showed pictures of her defensive wounds and explained that the different wounds to her head would have come from separate blows. They were also too deep to be caused by a fall, even at that height. One of them had a very odd shape, like a T. The prosecutor asked if these wounds could possibly have been caused by nunchucks or other martial arts, like a sai, that fork-like object, and the doctor said yes, they could have. The defense, though, made some really good points on cross-examination. It was all about emphasizing the lack of blood spatter. I'm currently back in school doing death investigation again, and it kinda blows my mind that there wasn't more blood. To me, it's almost more likely that Kenneth picked her up from his car and threw her over the edge of the cliff after beating her almost to death in his vehicle. That could also explain why her belongings were not found there. But it's true, the lack of blood does add reasonable doubt. Not to me, because I think the altercation happened in his car, and this was because he was forcing himself on her. She was resisting. If you haven't seen Samantha Josephson's case, you may not realize just how severe someone can be wounded in such a small space. You'd be surprised. I'll leave that in the cards. At the end, on redirect, the doctor explained that the wounds are similar in depth, and it wouldn't be the same if they were from a fall. Those wounds would be varied. There would be scratches, contusions, bumps, bruises, maybe some lacerations, but they wouldn't all be the same depth and not dissimilar. This was done in a more controlled manner. He ended with his opinion that it was not even possible that Bonnie merely accidentally fell off the cliff. What do you think happened? Trooper Tim Hunter later said that the strategy he used during Kenneth's initial interview paid off during the trial. Remember, Kenneth repeatedly said in that interview room that he had never seen Bonnie and had no idea who she was. So how does he explain this change in his story? Is he lying then or now? Because you have to know someone in order to have consensual sex with them. There was a forensic scientist who went into detail about all these things, like how long sperm can live. But the thing is, why would Bonnie be wearing panties and jeans that had semen on them from days or even a week before? I don't know, maybe it's possible. But the defense argues that Bonnie and Kenneth had sex, which was not on the day that she died, since there's no way to ascertain how long the sperm could have been there. That could put doubts in the jurors' minds. Kenneth's ex-wife takes the stand as well. She tells the court how Kenneth would disappear for weeks at a time. He wasn't even there when their daughter was born that same September that Bonnie was killed. She goes on to tell them she had even visited McHugh Creek with Kenneth after their daughter was born. This could have been before or after Bonnie was killed, but the fact is he was familiar with this place, and that's important. When leaving the courtroom that day, Karen actually called out to Tammy, his ex-wife. When she turned around, Karen gave her a hug and said, "I'm sorry." This is the ex-wife of her daughter's alleged killer. She told Tammy she was hoping that Kenneth would have taken a plea deal so that they could all be spared from having to rehash everything. Tammy just said, "Thank you," and walked away. I can't even imagine. That was probably so intense. Kenneth Dion never took the stand. The jury began deliberations on June 14th, 2011, and the next morning, Karen and Bonnie's family were on their way to a family interview on TV with Channel 11, which was a local station. When they got there, in the parking lot, they saw the cameraman and the reporter running to the van. They were leaving. Like, what's going on? They yelled, "They're back!" They were referring to the jury. They were back with the verdict. In Karen's mind, the early verdict meant it was going to be good news, and she was right. Karen was relieved when she heard that Kenneth was found guilty on all counts. She said that it was like a weight lifted off her shoulders, and everything was a blur after that. A lot of crying, cheering, and happiness mixed with sorrow. But at least there was closure. Despite the jury's verdict, Kenneth and his defense team maintained that he did not kill Bonnie Craig. At the October 2011 sentencing hearing, the prosecutor sought a 124-year sentence without parole, the maximum allowable according to the state. Kenneth did not show remorse or acceptance for his role in Bonnie's murder. Instead, he tried to be a tough guy and shouted out loud, "I won't take responsibility for it. I didn't do it." So when the prosecutor told the judge that Kenneth had never accepted responsibility, he said, "See, that answers that. There you go. See, he doesn't take any responsibility. He doesn't care." Kenneth Dion was sentenced to 124 years. He will, however, be eligible for parole at 80 years old. Even though Bonnie was mature for her age, responsible, aware of her surroundings, and armed with pepper spray, she was still overpowered by Kenneth. We will never know exactly what happened to her in that early morning in September on her way to class. But we do know that her death changed everyone's lives around her. As I mentioned, her sister, Samantha, went on to be a 911 dispatcher, and her brother Jason got his degree in paramedics. He said that after what happened to his little sister, he spends a lot more time with his own family and always emphasizes that that is the most meaningful thing in his life. He hopes his daughters can be like their aunt, but the heartache never fully fades away. Karen still can't believe Bonnie isn't here with her. It still shocks her that anyone would want to harm her sweet and kind daughter. Bonnie Craig's memory was honored with the creation of a homicide reward fund. This fund was set up to encourage Alaskans to come forward with information about 4 cold cases of young women. Karen says that the purpose of this fund can be expanded so that they could cover other unsolved murders if it's approved by the board. All I have to say is a lot of things, but I will say this. At least this case haunts me. It really does, as a mom. Knowing everything that this family had gone through and everything Karen had already been through in her life, we tend to forget the ripple effect of someone's murder.